Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Bold Ideas, Better Solutions online symposium. On behalf of the Hopkins Centre, I'm delighted to extend a warm welcome to all of our Hopkins Centre members, partners and collaborators who are joining us from all over Australia. I'm Professor Tamara Ownsworth and I'm the Research Director at the Hopkins Centre, and I have the pleasure of chairing today's symposium. We're excited to have many speakers joining us to showcase 5 years of research at the Hopkins Centre. Before we begin today's proceedings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet, which are diverse lands across Australia, and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Today's event, Bold Ideas and Better Solutions, fondly known as BIBS, has a long tradition at the Hopkins Centre. In the past, we have held this event as a full-day event in person, but due to the COVID pandemic in recent years, it has been an online forum, sometimes a series of seminars, and today it is a half-day symposium. So this year's BIBS presentations will showcase the outcomes and impacts from 5 years of research at the Hopkins Centre. Presenters will share the latest interdisciplinary research and emerging ideas in the disability and rehabilitation field. Our program features Hopkins projects that provide insights into care transitions, service access, innovative strategies for consumer citizen engagement and co-design, and ways of promoting dignified participation for people with a disability. We have a stimulating mix of oral presentations from the Centre's flagship projects, including Trace, Habitat and Dignity, and we're also pleased to be showcasing some select C grant projects and clinical fellowships. And embedded throughout the program, we'll have the opportunity for audience question and answer forums. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Binks, who is Vice President, Industry and External Engagement at Griffith University. And Peter is joining us to officially welcome everyone to the event. Thank you very much, Peter.
Tamara. And hello, everyone. Good morning and welcome to the Bold Ideas, Better Solutions online seminar. On behalf of Griffith University, I'm really proud to be welcoming you all here to a showcase of what I think is an extraordinary compilation of conducted and ongoing research. As Tamara said, my name is Peter Binks. I'm the Vice President of Engagement at Griffith University. And let me also echo Tamara in acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which each of us is coming to this symposium today. In my case, I'm on the lands of the Turrbal and Jagera people. Griffith University, we acknowledge not only the lands of all the people who have been custodians of this through the time, but all Indigenous peoples who work with us in every particular area. It's a really important aspect for us, and it's one that we're trying to imbue in every part of our work. We're also delighted to act today as a host with the Hopkins Centre of this important event. And in doing so, we'd like to acknowledge the foundation partnership between Griffith and Metro South Health that led to the establishment of the Hopkins Centre. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Timothy Geraghty, who's the co-director of the Hopkins Centre, who's also the medical chair of the Division of Rehabilitation at Metro South Health. I will also acknowledge Professor Elizabeth Kendall, one of my personal heroes, who is co-director of the Hopkins Centre, and Professor Tamara Ownsworth, research director from Griffith. Let me just say a thing or two about our university. Griffith University is a different institution. In many ways, we're an unconventional university. We've been operating for nearly 50 years, and we've worked in fields that, fields that offer less headline-grabbing recognition than many other universities, but probably have more impact for Australia, our region, and the world. We pursued environmental science and issues in social justice for most of our short life, well before these were offered for study in other institutions. We're proud of our nurses. We trained most of the nurses in Queensland. Our teachers, most of the teachers under 40 were trained at Griffith University. People like our criminologists who work in correctional services, our engineers who work in disaster preparedness, and our musicians who teach in rural areas. These are the kind of things that are really important to Griffith. We pride ourselves not so much in the way in which we work in university rankings, but in our efforts to make a real difference, to make it matter, and to improve the lot of Queenslanders, Australians, and the entire global society. We're at the forefront of discovery in quite a few fields, driven to better understand our world and improve people's lives within that. And that commitment was demonstrated, I'm sure you hear more of this as we go on, when the Australian newspaper's Higher Education Analysis in 2022 listed Griffith as the leader in disability and rehabilitation research. And that was something that we are extraordinarily proud of. The Hopkins Centre is at the centre of this story. The Hopkins Centre is one of the most important things we can do in this field, with your outstanding success in growing a multidisciplinary and collaborative research culture across Griffith and the Division of Rehabilitation in Metro South Health, and with other divisions in multiple hospital and community service sites. I'm sure you're all aware that the Hopkins Centre is named in recognition of Dr. Paul Hopkins AO, a rehabilitation physician who changed the face of rehabilitation in Queensland and became one of Australia's most influential rehabilitation practitioners over about 4 decades. In that time, he established or developed rehabilitation services and clinics for Queensland and for Australia. Importantly, he pioneered a person-centred approach to interdisciplinary practice, and he advocated tirelessly to protect the dignity of people with disabilities. Metro South Health and Griffith University have honoured the legacy of Dr. Paul Hopkins by crafting the Hopkins Centre on his values and pursuing research questions that intrigued him throughout his remarkable career. The Hopkins Centre has created a vibrant culture that nurtures research and values partnerships through collaborative projects that cross boundaries and have real impact. So today we'll see the outcome of that. The Hopkins Centre is showcasing 5 years of that research success. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you here to be part of the showcase and also part of the ongoing conversation that flows from today, and will continue to grow research just like this. Thank you again, and I'll pass back to Professor Tamara Ownsworth.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peter Binks, for your warm introduction and support of the Hopkins Centre. Before we move into our first research session, I just have a few housekeeping items. As you're all aware, internet connection will vary in this online environment. So if you do experience technical difficulties, please hover over the 3-dot button on the lower right of your page and click Info to chat with our technical assistants for support. We also welcome people to ask questions throughout today. And to do that, you just need to hover over the same 3 dots at the bottom right of your page and press Ask. The Q&A column will appear so you can type your question. The question will go to our event moderating team, and then the question will be asked during the group Q&A times. So we're not having questions at the end of individual presentations. We'll hold these over for a group Q&A. But please feel free to post your questions as you think of them throughout today. You can also view and add any comments to the chat function on the top right speech bubble. Closed captions have been enabled for the whole event and will appear at the bottom of the screen. I'm now very pleased to commence the first research session for today, which will focus on care transitions and service access. So just by way of background to this session, the Hopkins Centre has been systematically mapping and analysing rehabilitation outcomes and care pathways after brain and spinal injury since 2017. Our flagship program, TRACE, is the first longitudinal study in Queensland to establish a comprehensive data set on rehabilitation outcomes of individuals after spinal cord injury or acquired brain injury. The data set includes service use and access points across the first 12 months after leaving inpatient rehabilitation, and the research examines how these relate to health outcomes. Crisis is an extension of the TRACE program that added an 18-month data point and assessment. And this entailed expert stakeholder forums and online surveys with people with spinal cord injury to examine secondary health complications and service access during system disruption arising from the COVID-19 pandemic. The third project showcased this morning is the Transition to Subacute project, which is a collaboration with the Allied Health Professions Office of Queensland that aims to examine the transition journeys for patients receiving subacute care and rehabilitation in regional and rural areas of Queensland, closer to patients' home, which is usually in a smaller local hospital. So I'd now like to introduce the speakers and their topics for session 1. So we have Professor Tim Geraghty as the first speaker, and Tim is the co-director of the Hopkins Centre and also medical chair for the Division of Rehabilitation Metro South Health. And Tim will be presenting on TRACE, which stands for Trajectories of Rehabilitation Across Complex Environments. Our second speaker will be Dr. Christy Hogan, who is a research fellow at the Hopkins Centre, and Christy will be presenting on CRISIS, which stands for Complex Rehabilitation in Systems Under Immense Stress. Our third speaker for the first session is Jessica Bowley, who is a research assistant at the Hopkins Centre, and Jess will be reporting on the outcomes of the Transition to Subacute project. So just to remind people that we won't have questions after individual sessions, but please don't hesitate to ask questions and to pop these in the Q&A column, which you can access through the three dots on the bottom lower right of your screen. So it is now my great pleasure to introduce our first presenter, Professor Tim Geraghty. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you very much, Tamara, and welcome everyone. As Tamara said, I've been given the somewhat unenviable task of talking about 6 years of our TRACE program research in 10 minutes. So I will apologise in advance that this will be a little high level and I'll be moving along fairly quickly. So as Tamara mentioned, the TRACE research program is prospective longitudinal cohort studies in people with spinal cord injury and brain injury, looking at the effect of health service use, access to services, unmet needs, service obstacles and transitions, and the effect on psychological well-being and quality of life. And it's looking at that across the first 12 months after discharge at various time points. And it incorporates longitudinal survey data linkage, spatial data, as well as qualitative methods. And the overall goal is to understand access complexity across multiple systems and outcomes with the aim of improving system performance. Just to remind you, TRACE 1 and TRACE 2, TRACE 2 recruited 165 people and TRACE 1 recruited 165 and TRACE 2 recruited 120 people, with the recruitment for TRACE 2 impacted by the pandemic. So I'm going to try and give you an overview using some of the published papers as a basis for that. Please don't try and read the abstracts. I will give you some brief summaries. The first paper was the protocol paper, which obviously just set out what TRACE was trying to achieve, and that was related to TRACE 1. Other key papers from TRACE 1, this paper looked at health service use, unmet need and service obstacles and the effect on quality of life and psychological well-being in the spinal cord injury group. And the main findings were that financial obstacles were associated with a poorer health-related quality of life and higher anxiety. Hospitalisation was associated with a lower visual analog score on quality of life, but also associated with lower anxiety. And interestingly, allied health use was associated with higher anxiety. The next paper looked more closely at people with brain injury and the personal factors and unmet need and service obstacles and the relationship between health service use and outcome. And this paper found that there was evidence that a transitional rehabilitation service was associated with better psychological well-being scores, but it didn't find any relationship between the other factors there and service use and quality of life on psychological well-being or participation. The next paper also looked at the ABI group specifically and the impact of obstacles to service access on functioning and disability. And this paper showed that transportation was a significant obstacle for people accessing services in the first 6 months post-discharge. It also found that financial obstacles were often associated with poorer recovery outcomes. This paper, which has just actually yesterday been published in the Australian Health Review, looked at the use and cost of medical benefits schedule and pharmaceutical benefits scheme services for people discharged in the first 12 months, and found that the average costs for both schemes, out-of-pocket costs for both schemes, was about $300 a year, but for some people, the costs were much higher. There was a significant range there, and some people had much more significant out-of-pocket costs. Overall, it found there was a high degree of variability and high costs associated with MBS and PBS use. And that raises a concern generally about the financial hardship faced by people in that first 12 months. Moving on to TRACE 2 now, and this first paper looked at the proximity to services and also service obstacles. And it found that access potential was highly variable for people. This focused on Southeast Queensland. There were several low access, high disability population areas, and these were generally to the north and west of Greater Brisbane, where people had more difficulty accessing services. And 27% of participants indicated that transportation and finances were an obstacle to accessing services. As well, they found that the longer the travel times to allied health services, the more likely it was to be considered an obstacle to being able to access those services. These are the heat maps that were developed through that study. And this is looking at Brisbane, Ipswich, Lowood, and the smaller map goes further south to the Gold Coast and up to Noosa and Gympie. So basically, the more green you see, the easier it is to access the service. The more red and brown you see, the more difficult, or it takes a longer time. So you can see here that rehabilitation, looking at the medical specialties, had the best access, whereas something like plastics had much poorer access. And similarly with allied health services, you can see that speech pathology and psychology probably overall had more difficult access. The next paper, we looked at the methodologies that are used to measure access to services, and that hasn't really been looked at before. The overall conclusion here was that many of the measures that are used to measure access now are unidimensional, and they tend to look at the issue from the point of view of the health system rather than taking a more nuanced look and considering the personal and experiential factors. And we need better measures to do that. This next paper looked at care transitions. So these are the movements that people make between different levels of healthcare use. So in this case, we looked at primary, specialist, and emergency use. And the finding was that there were many variable, unique patterns that people took, and that people with brain and spinal cord injury had very complex and diverse care transitions. And Each one of these small squares represents an individual, and you can see on the y-axis the primary, specialist and emergency, and we've been able to map how people go back and forth between those levels of care. And finally, looking at stigma following spinal cord injury and brain injury. And the main findings were that stigma levels didn't differ significantly between brain and spinal cord injury participants. And stigma was positively associated with psychological distress at discharge and at 3 months. And at 3 months, stigma predicted long-term community integration. And all of those papers have been submitted for publication recently. So I won't go into all of this. Tamara has mentioned there are a whole lot of other projects which are related to the TRACE project, and we'll hear a bit more about those with coming speakers. So overall, just to try and summarise those outcomes, transport was a barrier at 6 months. For people with brain injury. Financial obstacles were related to reduced access for people with brain injury. Transitional rehabilitation service increased psychological well-being. There were access hotspots where people had more difficulty accessing services around Brisbane, and transport and financial factors again came up as important. There was large variability in out-of-pocket costs, and that raises concerns for cost burden. Again, financial obstacles were found to be important, related to reduced quality of life and increased anxiety in people with spinal cord injury. And again, financial obstacles found to be related to increasing the impact of functional impairment. Perceptions of rehabilitation adequacy at 6 months can affect mental health in the long term. We need to improve the measures that we use to look at service access, and we need to remember that access is more than just contact with these services. It's understanding the personal aspects and the impact on outcomes. People have many diverse care transitions in the first 12 months, and again, transport obstacles were a problem. And stigma can be associated with psychological distress at discharge, and also impact on long-term community integration. There's a complex interplay of factors that disrupt transitions and impact on rehabilitation outcomes. These can include secondary complications, service obstacles, financial and transport-related stresses. And we need to understand the timing and the interactive effect of these, and particularly the implications for major life events such as return to work, home and community. And we probably need to look more closely at the personal and the individual factors when we seek better solutions to these. And just a quick plug for what's next, and we are working on TRACE 3. There's still some things to be finalised there, so I will just leave you with that teaser at the moment. I'm also running out of time, so I'd just like to thank the TRACE team, which is a huge team of people, as well as other investigators and co-authors. That's just to show off the publications. And finally, to thank our funders for who have been many and varied, particularly MACE, Metro South, Griffith, and the Research Support Scheme. Thank you, and apologies for going a little over time. And I'd just like to introduce now our next speaker, who is Christy Hogan, who's going to talk a bit more about an aspect of the complex rehabilitation in systems under immense stress part of the program, which is the crisis projects. Thanks, Christy, over to you.
Thank you, Tim. So as was previously mentioned, today I'll be presenting on the crisis size study. So the overall aim of the study was to examine the impacts of health system stress caused by the COVID-19 pandemic on people with spinal cord injury living in Queensland. Firstly, we mapped secondary complications, access concerns, and identified problem-solving ideas by analysing self-reported lived experience of people with spinal cord injury in the community, as well as capturing the perspectives of critical stakeholders. Secondly, we aim to examine health and rehabilitation service use and secondary complications over an 18-month period in 2 SCI cohorts, discharge pre and post-COVID. We also plan to examine differences in the outcomes for participants with motor vehicle accident-related spinal cord injury. So these second analyses are still underway, so this presentation will focus on the first part of this study. To achieve the first aim, 34 people living with spinal cord injury completed a qualitative online survey advertised on the Spinal Life Australia Peer Support Facebook page between August and November 2021. Additionally, in September 2021, 2 expert stakeholder forums were run with 16 participants in total. This included 10 clinicians representing specialist inpatient and community spinal cord injury services and representatives from 3 consumer organisations, including an additional 2 representatives with spinal cord injury and 1 compensation agency. Results from both the survey and forums were analysed thematically. So we've submitted a manuscript that presents the survey and forum results as a single unified narrative regarding the impact of the pandemic on physical and mental well-being, access to services and suppliers, and the use of workarounds to mitigate adversity. Firstly, unwanted physical impacts were a common concern for people with spinal cord injury early in the pandemic. Survey participants reported reduced physical access and exercise due to a lack of access to physiotherapy, hydrotherapy, and gyms. This was because either facilities were being shut down or because people were confined to their home. This then often led to an increase in secondary complications, for example, muscle stiffness, pain, spasticity, and a loss of function. One forum participant explained, when you know what they're capable of and how hard they've worked to get there, and then you're watching that just go backwards and then losing independence and function, that was tough to watch. Undesirable impacts on mental health were also reported by most survey respondents. This included experiencing isolation and mental health issues, including anxiety, stress, and depression, among others. One survey participant reported being very bored, and we all became depressed due to a lack of human contact. A forum participant also shared that we know that social connection is such a protective factor, and it completely dropped off for a lot of people. Mental health has been the big issue and a big concern. Some survey respondents also reported relationship breakdowns and increased physical and mental burden on their significant others as they had to step into the role of a support worker to fill the service gaps. Secondly, there were significant impacts on access to usual health and community services. Service cancellations or reductions were reported by most participants throughout the pandemic. More than a third also reported difficulty accessing support and restricted community access. Because hospital inpatient capacity needed to be increased in preparation for a potential COVID wave, this resulted in very rapid discharge planning, leading to increased responsibility and stress on specialist SCI community services. One forum respondent stated, I think the early discharges, whether they are by the health system wanting people to get discharged or people wanting to be discharged themselves, the fallout is just that we're seeing bigger problems at home. However, later when the community services were increasingly reduced, discharge from inpatient services was often delayed, often due to delays in housing modifications. One forum participant stated, if we're all on lockdown or there are restrictions, then you don't get your home mod started. You can't discharge. You have a backlog for people coming in the front door if people can't get home. Thirdly, survey respondents reported problems with the cost, delays, and deliveries of consumables. People also reported difficulties accessing equipment, parts, and repairs. For example, one respondent waited 9 months for parts for a hoist, an essential item, to be repaired. Others had problems accessing continence supplies and gloves. And this issue was not just related to injury-specific equipment, but also iPads and computers that were needed for the increase in telehealth and virtual communication. One forum respondent stated, "That's been a massive problem, getting equipment and aids, getting allied health to the people, getting equipment to the people, ordering the equipment. And that goes with telehealth as well, with getting suddenly iPads, computers, technology." Despite the potential advantages of technology, several respondents struggled with virtual communication, while some forum participants found telehealth to be a nice escalation pathway now. Positive impacts were also identified, including easier disability-friendly access to shops. Respondents noted that at times there was less traffic, allowing for safer short-distance travel and easier access at shopping centres. Secondary complications covered both physical and psychosocial domains. So common physical complications included muscular deterioration, skin problems, weight gain, neurological problems, and hypertension. One participant remarked that when the physiotherapy services shut, their legs became very tight. One forum participant commented about situations where the person has not been able to come get the acute treatment necessary post-injury. They have been remotely hospitalised and very quickly they develop UTIs, pressure injuries, sepsis. They lack expertise in managing spinal cord injury. By the time they get to the spinal injuries unit, they've got to get extended medical treatment, which delays rehabilitation. While 38% of survey respondents reported no complications, others reported psychosocial complications, including suicidal ideation, loss of employment, and marriage breakdowns. This highlighted the diversity of experience for people living with spinal cord injury in the community. Almost a quarter of survey respondents were unable to identify any solutions, and 3 had resigned themselves to their circumstances. Survey respondents also regarded technology, shopping less frequently, and shopping online as potential solutions. And others tried a self-directed approach to exercise, planned for and sourced alternative supports, developed new work or home routines, developed new personal strategies, including avoiding the news, relaxation techniques, and increasing time spent doing hobby activities. So the implications: statewide planning is needed in order to safeguard the availability of necessary resources and specialised healthcare and support workers able to care for vulnerable populations during prolonged periods of disruption. Centralised planning is needed to enable consumables to be stockpiled with simpler access to products and equipment, and decentralised planning is needed to proactively ensure local backup plans are in place. And finally, multi-level advocacy and planning is needed to protect the capacity and availability of healthcare and support workers and to maintain cohesion between these workers and community organisations. So the core implication is that we must work together to avoid the scenario in which vulnerable people who depend on specialised healthcare and support fail to receive them, only to inadvertently develop complications that isolate them further from the quality of life that is their right and increase the need for access to the very services which are restricted. So the analyses for the second aim are underway and due to be completed by the end of the year. And we've developed a knowledge translation plan with the project's advisory group, which outlines the plan to disseminate and translate the research findings. So far we've submitted 1 manuscript for publication with another in the works, and an industry report will also be shared with Queensland Health and the relevant spinal organisations. We've also developed consumer and participant summaries and infographics, which have been shared with participants. And I've included some examples in the following slides, which highlights the key findings. So sorry, these are a bit too small to see, but they will be available soon. So thank you for giving me the honour to share our findings this morning. I'd also like to thank all of the participants who shared their time and their expertise with us. And I would now like to hand over to Hopkins Research Assistant Jessica Bowley to talk about the Transition to Subacute project, which looks at understanding the barriers and enablers of quality care transitions.
Good morning. My name is Jessica Bowley, and as Christy said, I'm a research assistant at the Hopkins Centre. In this presentation, I will be reporting the findings of the second and third phases of the Transition to Subacute project undertaken by the Hopkins Centre on behalf of the Transition to Subacute Collaborative with support from the Allied Health Professions Office of Queensland. The Transition to Subacute project is an initiative of an allied health collaborative representing allied health professionals from Central West, Central Queensland, North West and Townsville Hospital and Health Services. The broad objective of the Transition to Subacute project was to improve patient transitions between levels of care and across different health systems in the subacute phase of their recovery, that is, following acute hospital discharge. It was anticipated that by expediting the transfer of patients to care closer to home, this would help to minimise displacement from communities and contribute to greater system efficiency in large regional and metropolitan hospitals. Phase 2 of this research aimed to examine subacute patients' transition journeys using chart, audit and interview data from rehabilitation and geriatric evaluation and management, or GEM, patients in Queensland. The objectives of Phase 2 were first to examine the healthcare transitions of rural and remote living patients with ongoing subacute needs, and second to explore these patients' experiences of client-centeredness and continuity of care, and the common challenges faced by rural and remote patients transitioning to and through subacute care in a non-metropolitan context. From these findings, in further extension of this work, a scoping review was then conducted. The objectives of this third phase were to examine the models and mechanisms being used to facilitate transitions of care of older subacute patients, how these differentially influence care transitions, and the processes or conditions that function as barriers to and/or enablers of effective transitions of care. In Phase 2, quantitative chart audits and qualitative patient and family interviews were conducted between June 2019 and December 2020. Chart audits were collected from 97 rehabilitation and GEM type patients. From this larger sample, 37 participants and their families were then selected to participate in semi-structured interviews, exploring a series of broad, open-ended questions, seen on screen, to ascertain patients' individual subacute transition experiences. A descriptive summary of key themes was subsequently derived. Indicators of client-centered care related to the interpersonal qualities and adaptability of staff, experiences of being involved and informed in goal setting and decision-making, a sense of being listened to and having wishes heard, and the extent to which transition preferences were respected and advocated for. While most participants reported positive interpersonal experiences with subacute staff, two opposing experiences of being involved and informed in goal setting and decision-making were evident. Many participants highlighted the value of being well informed and appreciated being asked questions that allowed them to have input into their care planning. In contrast, others reported limited involvement and a desire to be more involved in planning and decision making. Access to and involvement in rehabilitation services, staffing continuity, the communication of patient information, and a desire to be closer to family and social support systems were the most common factors influencing continuity of care. Participants valued having access to rehabilitation and generally reported a strong desire to be actively involved or more heavily involved in rehabilitation programs. Some participants acknowledged a preference for greater continuity in relation to staffing arrangements, and several acknowledged the impact of interdisciplinary communication and effective information transference. Given the positive interpersonal relationships many patients developed with healthcare staff, separation from these relationships when transitioning to new care environments was often viewed as a challenge. In some cases, staffing changes also led to breakdowns in the effective transfer or successful communication of patient information, which was a source of frustration for patients and family members. Finally, a desire to be closer to home and to family, friends, and support systems was a very common theme amongst participants. Most acknowledged the importance of having access to family and friends and a preference for receiving care closer to home. Many also reported difficulties associated with being separated from loved ones due to proximity to services and/or extended lengths of stay. Several challenges associated with transitioning to and through subacute environments, including the financial, psychological, and familial impacts of receiving care far from home, and perceptions about the quality of care in rural and remote locations versus regional or metropolitan facilities were acknowledged. Overwhelmingly, the greatest barrier to accessing care closer to home were perceptions about the quality of care available in rural and remote locations. Participants often reported poorer perceptions about the quality of care in rural facilities, and many expressed hesitancy about transitioning to care in rural or remote sites in comparison to regional or metropolitan facilities. However, despite this hesitation, participants who did transition rural or remote generally reported satisfaction with the care received once they had transitioned. Based on the findings of phase 2, several implications were identified. Successful transition experiences are often characterised by the degree to which patients feel involved and informed. Therefore, establishing a shared understanding of patients' preferences and addressing individual access concerns earlier in the subacute journey appears to be an integral part of improving overall satisfaction with care. While access to adequate and equitable care was the first major consideration in relation to continuity of care, this evaluation also highlighted the importance of maintaining continuity of access to family and social supports. Thus, subacute providers may need to reconsider how continuity of care is characterised with specific and differential respect to rural and remote subacute patients to better acknowledge and accommodate their unique care and access requirements. Finally, better education and endorsement of the quality of care available in rural and remote locations is needed. Based on the current findings, many patients express hesitancy about receiving care outside of regional or metropolitan locations. Thus, increasing awareness of the quality of services available in rural remote sites appears to be an important consideration to improve access and offset patient apprehension about stepping down rural. As an extension of the work carried out in phase 2, a scoping review of the literature was then conducted with a specific focus on older subacute populations and the models and mechanisms that facilitate transitions of care of these populations through different systems, levels, and locations of subacute healthcare. 22 studies were included in the final review, and 12 established models and 20 individual mechanisms for facilitating transitions of care were identified. Heterogeneity in the models and mechanisms implemented across different international health systems was highlighted. The review also highlighted contention in systems caught between maintaining the efficiency required to meet organisational needs and delivering the quality of healthcare necessary to support older, complex patients through effective transitions of care. Subsequently, system-level processes, as seen on the screen, appear to have a particularly critical influence on transition outcomes and can present as either considerable barriers or critical enablers of effective transitions of care. Many studies also highlighted the importance of enhancing multi-system coordination and cooperation. Specifically, continuity with primary care and primary healthcare services was commonly endorsed. Also highlighted was the value of facilitating staffing continuity across the continuum of care. Staffing continuity in this respect went beyond staffing consistency in a single setting. Rather, staffing continuity was mechanised by dedicated and sustained involvement beyond the point of transition from a single location, instead following patients through their subsequent steps down to different levels and locations of subacute health and community care. Finally, and critically, irrespective of context or variation in the models and mechanisms used, similar individual factors remained essential to facilitating effective transitions of care, including information continuity, patient-centred care practices, and education and training. The findings of this review, in conjunction with the findings of phase 2, highlight the complexities associated with facilitating transitions of care of vulnerable populations with ongoing subacute needs, and the degree to which effective transitions are contingent upon complex, complementary interactions between systems, healthcare staff, and patients and their caregivers. Successful transitions remain reliant on cooperation and sustained communication between different systems, levels, and locations of care, which continues to be a critical consideration for healthcare providers, given the ongoing challenges identified in these areas. The importance of prioritising therapeutic relationships between providers, patients and caregivers is also emphasised. In the absence of strong therapeutic partnerships, patients and caregivers often feel insufficiently informed, which ultimately hinders their ability to be actively involved in their care planning. The essential role of informal caregivers was also repeatedly highlighted. It appears essential that care providers not only involve but actively collaborate with families and caregivers at each stage of the care journey as the key providers of care across the subacute continuum and far beyond. Importantly, based on the findings of the Phase 3 review, in the absence of an informal caregiver, a comparable caregiver effect was observed in nurse-coordinated care transition models, which facilitated staffing continuity across the continuum of care. Therefore, in the absence of family or caregiver advocacy, staffing continuity may be a particularly important mechanism to support more effective transitions of care, especially for vulnerable patients who may be ill-equipped to advocate for themselves. Finally, with further reference to the findings of the scoping review, despite the value placed on patient education and self-management, transition mechanisms to support these aspects of care were less commonly endorsed at the patient level than they were at the staff and service levels in the included studies, suggesting the need for further emphasis and improvement of these mechanisms. Increasing patient and familial education can support patients to be more informed and confident in their decisions relating to their care, and in turn facilitate better adherence, self-advocacy and self-confidence, each of which appear to be critical to ensuring transitions of care are effective and remain effective beyond discharge. Thank you very much for listening. I believe I am now heading over to Tamara for the group Q&A. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jessica. And I just want to thank all of our speakers in this session. I think it's such a significant body of work, what you've each presented, and it's wonderful to see this all integrated. And I imagine the audience is thinking a lot about what the implications are. So we do have a number of questions waiting for you. So if we can have everyone on screen so that I can direct the questions appropriately or open it up for discussion. So the first question that's come through is a query about TRACE, actually, Tim. So it's in relation to NDIS and whether funding schemes emerged as an important issue for the TRACE cohort.
Thanks, Tamara. In the TRACE 1 studies, it was the NDIS was still in its early stages, so we didn't have a large number of participants who were on the NDIS at that stage, so it was a little difficult to look at that specifically. Certainly, as I mentioned, the financial obstacles was something that did keep coming up. We didn't tend to look specifically at individual funding schemes in TRACE, but certainly the financial obstacles appeared to still be there despite people being on funding schemes. But I would say that the whole issue of lifetime funding is something that we're interested in looking into more, and we probably don't have enough data to really give a definitive answer on that at this stage. We did do, as part of the READY study that I mentioned as one of the associated studies, did look at the impacts of NDIS on the process of discharge from hospital for these groups. And that certainly showed that there were delays in discharge associated with some of the difficulties in working through and coordinating between the hospital discharge processes and the NDIS processes. But it's, as I say, it's an area that we would like to do a bit more work in the future.
Thanks, Tim. And there's actually a related question, given the barrier of financial hardship, which came through so clearly in the findings, what impact do you think the rising costs of living are going to have on patients and their families in the public system?
Yes, I think, it's almost a perfect storm at the moment. Not only the rising cost of living, but also the, social housing crisis that the country is in. So, I think it's an area, where it's unfortunately not looking like it's going to get easier for people, but it also means that we need to continue to look at solutions which understand the personalized needs of people, but also tries to bring various systems together to find the solution, as the various funding schemes do. But housing, I think, is a big area which probably we need to look more closely at, and is not well solved by the current processes.
Yeah, so financial hardship, housing and transport, they're all...
Financial and transport, as you could see, kept coming up in various forms as being a problem, and housing as well.
Yeah, thanks. So perhaps from the Trace presentation and also Jess's presentation, Jess, if you want to chime in, but Tim might answer this initially. What are, do you think, some of the characteristics of effective care transition? So what facilitates or enables smoother, continuous care transitions for people? What seems to be important?
Well, certainly based on looking at one of the issues is that there hasn't been a lot of specific work in spinal cord injury and brain injury looking at care transitions, but if we base it on some of the work that's been done in other areas, including geriatric areas, stroke, then looking at more personalised approaches, so things like having care coordinators, case management approaches, care navigators, that sort of approach, but it needs to be people who can work across the systems, from primary care to specialist care into the emergency department, and really coordinate across all of those level of cares. I think what we're postulating is that it needs to probably be more intensive, or could be more intensive, so that we're taking a more individualized and personal approach to trying to solve care transitions. But I think, again, it's an area that we've just really touched on at the moment, and I think we need to look a bit more into the specifics around brain injury and spinal cord injury. And of course, we have our own sort of specialist community teams that work in those areas already. So having that specialist input. The other thing that is often talked about is using digital systems, but again, they need to be a system that is capable of working across primary care, secondary care, hospital, that actually is able then to be used to guide people and assist with the transitions in a useful way. And of course, person-centered care is the other aspect that keeps coming up in the literature as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So a whole of systems approach. This isn't an easy service level solution. Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, well, that leads me into the next question, which is actually what's next for the Trace and Crisis program. So where is the research heading next, Tim?
as Christy mentioned, the crisis work we're still finishing off at the moment. It's extending a data point to 18 months, and it's looking more closely. It's bringing in secondary conditions, which was not something we looked at specifically during the Trace 1 and Trace 2. And it's looking specifically at people with spinal cord injury, and also trying to look at the impacts of the pandemic on health service use and access. Trace 3, I almost feel like I should hand that question back to you, Tamara, but but in the future. So we are definitely looking at Trace 3. We are working out at the moment exactly what that's going to look like. We want to look again at secondary conditions and some of the personal and psychological issues that are important. We want to look more closely at some of the impacts of our own specialist services in that area. And so we're really pulling all of that together now as we speak.
We are. So I'm really pleased that this research is forging ahead, and that we're able to learn from Trace 1 and Trace 2 and really build on those findings, but extend them into other areas that have emerged from feedback from consumers and clinicians and industry partners as being really important to long-term outcomes for people. So I'd like to thank all three presenters, so Tim, Christy and Jess, for your wonderful, stimulating presentations. And just to flag that if there are some questions that we don't manage to get to in the group Q&A, we will follow up with our presenters, and all presenters have been asked to provide a copy of their presentations, and of course the recording for the entire event will be made available through our website. So virtual applause. Thank you very much to the presenters from session 1. We will now move on to session 2, which I'm also chairing, which is on clinician-led research and capacity building. Thank you very much to session 1 presenters. Okay, so just some background for session 2 on clinician-led research and capacity building. A main objective of the Hopkins Centre is to build effective interdisciplinary and collaborative research partnerships to ensure that the research conducted is close to practice, and that the findings translate into meaningful outcomes and improvements in practice and service delivery. The Hopkins Centre, we also aim to grow research capacity by supporting our early career researchers, clinicians and citizen researchers, so that we develop a skilled workforce across disability services and rehabilitation. So the presentations in session 2 will nicely showcase these objectives because we will be having presentations on clinician research capacity building, and also some selected presentations regarding outcomes of our seed grant and clinical fellowships. So I'd like to welcome our next 3 speakers, and I'll introduce all 3 of them in their topics. So our first speaker for session 2 will be Dr. Letitia Burridge, or Letty, and Letty is a research fellow at the Hopkins Centre, and Letty will be presenting on building research capacity in rehabilitation medical offices. The second presentation will be by Dr. Karen Watter, who is the clinical lead at the Acquired Brain Injury Transitional Rehabilitation Service, ABITRS, in Metro South Health. And Karen will be presenting on the outcomes of a seed grant project, and the topic is vocational rehabilitation in an early transitional brain injury service. Our third speaker is Glenn Werner-Wren, who is a physiotherapist in the Spinal Injuries Unit, Metro South Health. And Glenn was the recipient of a clinical fellowship, and he will be sharing the outcomes of that fellowship on the topic of optimising the process of care for management of people with a spinal cord injury on their orthopaedics ward at the Princess Alexandra Hospital. So just before we get things underway, I also want to let you know that it's a timely session for me to announce the seed grants and clinical fellowship opportunities for next year. So I will briefly be outlining these after the presentations, and we'll then move into a group Q&A session. So again, we won't have questions after each presentation, but if you could please post your questions in the Q&A function, and then we'll have a group Q&A forum at the end of the 3 presentations. But for now, I would like to introduce the first speaker, Dr. Letitia Burridge. Thank you, Letty.
Hello, everyone. This paper is from research about building research capacity in clinicians. Rehabilitation is the key health strategy for the century, so there's a need for research-informed practice. But doctors are often disengaged from research. There are strategies for building research capacity, but there are still gaps in practice. We believe in a culture of research-active clinicians for better services and better patient outcomes, but how should we build local research capacity? So, how should we build local research capacity? Beg your pardon. Our first aim was to identify the research state of play amongst rehab doctors. Our second aim was to explore their views on research training strategies. Why is this not going properly? This mixed method study used an online survey followed by focus groups. The study population comprised doctors working in rehab settings within Metro South Health. We used the research spider to measure levels of research skills and engagement. We also identified levels of research involvement, research and training priorities, and experience with clinical data such as AROC. We used descriptive analysis to summarise the survey data and thematic analysis to summarise the focus group transcripts. First, I'll give you an overview of the survey results. This sample of 14 represented a 30% response rate, and more than 3/4 of the sample were specialists, but the subsample for the focus groups was diverse and included a range of viewpoints. The survey results from this small sample tell us that, on average, few were research experienced and even fewer were confident with research. Only a fraction had at least moderate opportunity for research. Even so, a substantial majority were at least moderately interested in research, and about half had at least a moderate intent to do research. The standout priority was to turn an idea into a researchable question. The standout skill needs were, developing a proposal, Methods 101, Data Management 101, and Measuring Clinical Outcomes. In other words, what was lacking in capacity was counteracted by interest and intent, and by clearly identified priorities and skill needs. But the problem is, as one respondent said, the problem is complex, and putting together something needs buy-in from so many people, some of whom rotate frequently. I would like a long-term research project with many mini projects so that the registrar each term can contribute. Now let's see what the qualitative findings shed light, how sort of light they shed on the survey results. 3 groups of factors influence doctors' engagement with research: personal factors related to perceptions and expectations, process factors related to procedural complexity, and contextual factors related to competing priorities. Personal factors revolved around research competence and having to seek help. From the first focus group, I should know this. From the second focus group, I'm stuck. And the point is that expectations of self-sufficiency impede the normal research process for research-interested rehabilitation medical officers. The main concern with the research process was how to tackle its complexity. It is very front-heavy. Working alone with little time and skill may not achieve a lot. And the point is that numerous tasks create slow points that require teamwork. Contextual factors include barriers and enablers because research is like a luxury, but clinicians can value add with relevant research ideas, if not more. And the point is that they want to be research active, but it takes partnership. These qualitative findings bring 3 key insights to the survey results. Medical officers may not realise it's normal for research to be challenging and time intensive, or that trying to work independently can magnify this. Medical officers could make progress by networking and partnering with experienced researchers. These 2 points address the doing of research. Being research equipped is also important, and medical officers need access to research training that can accommodate their limited non-clinical time. To our knowledge, this mixed methods exploratory study of research capacity in rehabilitation medical officers is the first of its kind in Australia. The discrepancy between research interest and capacity is consistent with previous research that found specialist medical colleges require trainees to do research, but with little guidance as to how. Further research culture rewards solo researchers rather than team researchers. The research process is notoriously complex, which highlights the value of research training to build knowledge and skills. Equipping rehab doctors to generate good evidence is key to stronger rehab practice, locally to internationally. Having research skills and motivation isn't enough, as there are still structural hurdles to overcome in the practice context. And key to overcoming these hurdles are initiatives such as on-campus collaborations with experienced researchers, plus training and support that are tailored to local setting needs. The survey response rates reflect clinical workloads under pandemic conditions. It's possible that those who participated were more research motivated than their peers, but the results are useful for the study setting, although they may not be generalisable. One answer to the challenges of doing research is to upskill. In the Division of Rehabilitation, we have developed self-directed learning modules for getting started in research, an in-person workshop for moving forward with research, and we provide ad hoc one-to-one access for people. And I'm keeping up with my trusty companion here. In the longer term, structural change is needed to tailor local conditions so they enable trainees and other clinicians to do research that will improve rehabilitation practice and outcomes. In conclusion, practicing rehabilitation doctors are very interested in research, but have limited research capacity. This study identified specific research needs and strategies to address them. Initiatives are needed that are tailored to local settings. Thanks to all who helped make this research possible, and thank you too for listening, and to my trusty companion here who's helped me with what I need to do. So thank you, everyone. I would now like to hand over to Hopkins clinical researcher, Dr. Karen Watter, to talk about vocational rehabilitation in early transitional brain injury service. Thank you, Karen.
There we go. Sorry, I finally found my mute button. Apologies, everybody. I am off to a fabulous tech start. But thank you all for having me here today, presenting on the work we've done, which has very much been facilitated by some seed grants from the Hopkins Centre. So today I'll be talking about developing and implementing evidence-based vocational rehab services in early transitional rehab for adults with acquired brain injury. And I'm presenting on behalf of our wonderful VOC Rehab team. The majority of these clinicians work and researchers work with me here at ABI-TRS, but also I'd like to acknowledge the wonderful Dr. Vanette McLennan from Griffith, who's been brilliant in her work in supporting us with this. So I'm going to talk more about our journey today that started with our service in ABI-TRS as a new clinical service, where we had a lovely clinical research journey in the area of vocational rehab for adults with ABI, which then became a translation and implementation journey and has now resulted in the work we started 4 or 5 years ago in ABI-TRS now having impact at a statewide level. And we started this with a lovely little seed grant from the Hopkins Centre at the start of, we applied in 2018. And then this grew into an implementation grant that we had last year, and that's what I'll be presenting on today. So we started very much with our clinical research journey as a new service in ABI-TRS back in 2017. And we were providing rehab to clients who are transitioning from hospital to home after severe brain injury. Under our pilot project, we actually had a mandate to look at vocational rehab services for this cohort of clients. And this was part of our KPIs and service outcomes within our MACE-funded project. We knew there was a clinical need. We had around 60% of our clients telling us they had goals of wanting to return to work and wanting to return to vocation. And we know, unfortunately, that globally, this is really hard to do, and the stats around return to work post-brain injury sit at around 40% of people manage to return to work. So there was a lovely alignment of need plus a reason that we had to look at this, and we developed a portfolio working group, and clinically we were developing our early processes and tools of how we would look at this as a service. Then along came the seed grants. And this provided those fabulous things that help clinicians do research. It provided us some funding, which provided us with some dedicated offline time and was very much the impetus to do this work. And this was matched, of course, by some in-kind time from our service here at TRS. So from our seed grant, we set out to investigate the evidence base for practice in vocational rehab or supporting people to return to work in Queensland for adults with acquired brain injury. And we wanted to develop a framework that would help us do this, that was evidence-based and would fit into our service model of early community rehabilitation. So we undertook a bit of a mega project in this. I think we aimed high, and we had 5 studies that fit into this initial seed grant. And this is really investigating that evidence base across the EBP model. So as well as doing a formal scoping review, we investigated the views and experiences of consumers, so people with injury and their partners or significant others, and of health professionals around their experiences of vocational rehab and return to work within the context of Queensland-based services and our setting. We also looked at the literature in these areas, and we were able to synthesise this information to develop a service delivery framework that was evidence-based and that we could implement in practice and very much supported our clinical work. And these studies are all completed, and we've developed our framework. If we look at the outcomes from this seed grant, we are impacting the international literature, that we have publications of our first 2 studies in international journals, and our 3rd study is currently undergoing a very prolonged review process, but hopefully will be published soon. Our final manuscript we will submit reports our final 2 studies, and we'll hopefully get this framework out there into the international literature as a way of providing VOC rehab for adults as part of a rehab program, not as a separate service. So that's a really exciting outcome for us. Clinically, we've had this beautiful feedback loop, having a clinical need, doing a research program to identify that evidence, and then having the things we're finding feed back into the work we're doing as a clinical team. So if we look at the change in practice at our service, we're providing structured evidence-based vocational rehab to our clients across that continuum of readiness to go back to work. We're doing this consistently across our teams, so regardless of who you work with, you'll have those similar elements to your program conducted, and we're meeting our client goals, and we are actively addressing their goals of wanting to return to work or a vocational activity. If we look at our clients who we were doing this with at the start of program versus the last year or two when these processes have very much been embedded, we can see the number of clients with these goals remain steady, just under 60%. But we've had a big change in the number of clients who are actively returning to a vocational role during their time with us. So that's within 10 weeks of hospital discharge. And I think there are a number of different reasons for this, but I do think one of them is this consistency of practice that we are now doing because of the work we've done around the framework. So from our seed grant, we then have a translation and implementation journey that I'll briefly talk about. So last year, we were successful in getting an implementation grant from the Hopkins Centre, which again was matched by our manager for our in-kind activity. And this really gave us, again, funding, which let us put some dedicated offline time into further progressing this work. And we had two real elements of this. We wanted to look at how that was happening in ABI-TRS, so further developing and formalising some of the clinical documents and processes and tools that we use to implement this service delivery framework into our clinical practice at TRS, but then also look at how could we implement this beyond our service and beyond our practice. So we wanted to develop a set of resources that would support others to translate our framework and make a plan to implement that within their practice or implement components of our framework or tools. So what are the outcomes from our implementation grant? We have formalised our tools and documents and processes for our local implementation at ABI-TRS, and we've actually developed a lovely implementation manual around our VOC rehab framework that summarises that. We've developed a workshop series that supports others to translate and implement the framework and tools into their clinical practice. Our first workshop provides the outline of that clinical research journey. And then our second workshop is an implementation science workshop where we provide our clinicians with some key evidence-based tools to help them identify their practice and then plan and translate and make an implementation plan for VOC rehab into their practice. And we've actually just finished delivering our first workshop series to just over 20 clinicians from across Queensland, and we finished that yesterday. So we've got this lovely translation and implementation happening beyond our service. So from these two lovely little grants, we've made, I think, some big contributions. We've made this at an international level with our research output and also getting our local contextual findings out into the literature. We've developed an evidence-based framework that's improving our service delivery, and we've developed our tools and processes that let us do that as a clinical team. And that has been translated and implemented in our service at ABI-TRS. Our service delivery has improved and our client experiences have improved. And I think we're influencing our client outcomes. And we've then also developed tools and resources that are going to help other people put this in practice. And that really has the potential to improve services, client outcomes and experiences beyond us. So have true translation beyond Hopkins and DOR, which is exciting. All right, thank you, everybody. I am going to stop sharing my slides now, and I'm going to hand over to our next presenter. So I would like to, let me find my right script. I would like to hand over now to the Hopkins Clinical Research Fellow, Glenn Werner-Wren, who's presenting on his fellowship. And this is around optimising the care process for the management of people with a spinal cord injury across the continuum of care. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Karen. I'm just bringing that one up. All right, so thank you, Karen, and good morning, everybody. my project was based on clinical redesign methodology. And clinical redesign is all about trying to address a known issue. And an issue that had been raised by orthopaedic clinicians was an inability to provide the desired level of care to an increasing number of people who had spinal cord injury, who were spending longer periods of time on the orthopaedics ward at the Princess Alexandra Hospital. And so that is what my study investigated. And the aim of the study was to try and improve that care by bridging the interface between acute care and rehabilitation. I was very lucky that I had a really highly experienced research team that definitely helped me through the whole process. And equally, I had a really highly credentialed and really invested steering committee who oversaw the project as well. So clinical redesign is broken down into two phases. So phase one is all about diagnostics, so getting a really good understanding about what the problem is before moving into phase two, which is developing tailored solution to those issues that you've identified in phase one. Phase one, I was very lucky to have a Hopkins Fellowship fund the phase, and then phase two, I also got a Hopkins seed grant. So what did we do in phase one diagnostics? So we did staff focus groups. And for those staff who couldn't attend the focus groups, we followed up with some individual interviews. To get the patient perspective, we did 13 patient interviews, and those patients also consented for us to review their charts. We also looked at some systems data and did some process mapping. So if we start with the data, what was the data showing us? So this first graph looks at the number of patients who had a spinal cord injury, who were spending time on orthopedics ward, who went eventually to the spinal injuries unit. And you can see pretty large numbers, and there is a slight increase over time. But where that increase becomes a lot more dramatic is how long they were staying on the wards. And again, looking at the graphs, the first couple of years, just kind of patients were staying for a week to that 10-day mark, but towards the end, they're really getting up to that 3 to 4 weeks of spending on an acute orthopedic ward. When you convert that into bed days, you can see that's quite a lot of bed days that these patients are taking up. And in 2020, we just did some further analysis, and of those 774 bed days, 602 were identified as being non-value added bed days. So that's what the quantitative data was saying. So then we did some thematic analysis on all the qualitative data, and basically we came up with two underlying themes. One was that there's inconsistent communication processes throughout the whole system, and also a lack of resourcing throughout the whole system. But then there were four kind of key themes that were identified. And the first of which was about medical process. And the crux of this one was really about trying to identify which consultant should be leading this patient's care. Should it be the orthopedic consultant because these patients are on the orthopedic ward under an orthopedic bed card? Or should it be the spinal consultant because these patients actually don't have any more acute orthopedic issues. They now have rehab needs, but the problem is they're not on the rehab ward. So technically they're not under the care of these rehab consultants. And so the problem was no one was really driving their care from that senior medical perspective. This made it really difficult for clinicians who are working with these patients. And patients also report that they were getting a lot of inconsistent information about their spinal cord injury. The next major theme was really about just the processes of the spinal injuries unit, and orthopedic clinicians reported a lot of confusion about the referral process, the eligibility criteria, when paperwork should be started, and there was also a lot of confusion about when did doctors from the spinal unit come up and review these patients? What was the purpose of the review? How frequently did this happen? So there was a lot of confusion about that process as well. The next key theme is about just really the difficulties of trying to provide rehab in an acute setting. And clinicians were talking about this is not their core business. They're not well set up in the acute block. They don't have the right environment. They don't have the right equipment, and they definitely felt like they didn't have the right skills or expertise to be trying to provide rehab care in these acute wards. And then the last thing was really talking about the fact that this issue had been going on for a long time, and it led to a lot of misconceptions between the two different work areas, and then a lot of frustrations as well that nothing had been done about this, and then again, confusion over whose responsibility it was to try and come up with a solution to these problems. What staff said were the impacts were, they said there's definitely delays in patient rehab. There was also concerns about staff burnout, injury, and just general dissatisfaction with the whole process. And there are also reports of hospital-wide impacts, namely the number of outliers now that had to be moved out of the orthopaedics ward because the beds were being taken by spinal patients, and then also reports of cancellation of elective surgeries because there were no longer enough beds on the acute wards to house these elective surgeries. So then we looked at as well the chart audit. So the purpose of the chart audit was really to kind of have a look and see how frequently were these patients being reviewed by whilst they were on the orthopaedics team. So the first table really just shows that of the 13 patients, 8 of them were under the orthopaedics team, 5 of them were under the neurosurgical team, but you can see the length of stay was pretty similar, and it's around that 20-day mark. Table 2 then looks at how long did it take for the spinal team to come up and review their patients after they received a referral. And you can see they came up pretty timely. So between 1 and 2 days, they were kind of seeing the patients. And then the second point there is how many times then were they reviewed by a spinal consultant. So again, in about 20 days, they were reviewed on 2 occasions. Then we look at allied health. And again, if we're thinking of the average length of stay was around that 20 days. Of that 20 days, on average, they were seen 13 of those days by a physio, 7 days by an OT, and then it really drops off to only 1.5 days by a senior orthopedic nursing staff, 1 day by psychology, and 1.5 days by social work. And then if we look at how often they were reviewed by the medical team, well, under the orthopedics team, again, if we think of 18 days with their length of stay, they weren't even hitting 1 day on average that they were seen by a consultant. They weren't seen by a consultant, by a fellow. 10 days by a registrar or a primary house officer, and 12 by a junior medical officer, and a pretty similar picture for the neurosurgeon. So they weren't seen at all by a consultant or a fellow, half the time seen by a registrar, and they were seen pretty frequently by junior medical officers. So what did kind of the data show us? And I think that the quantitative data definitely supported that hypothesis that yes, we are seeing a slight increase in patients, but they are definitely staying for longer periods of time. And the qualitative data said that yet there are a number of system and process issues that are contributing to probably not providing the best level of care to these patients. So what did we do about it? So we then moved into phase 2 solutions design. Now we had 2 solutions workshops, and these were really well attended by all the key stakeholders, which was really great to see. In the first workshop, we came up with priorities, and the priorities, again, weren't surprising. Number 1 was that medical leadership. Number 2 was the spinal processes. It was thought we could really try and be able to clarify and quite easily make improvements in the referral and the review processes. And then the third priority was to improve staff and patient education. So following that workshop, a few working groups were formed, and together with the research team, as well as the steering group, we came up with 3 kind of tangible and meaningful solutions. And the first of which was the initiation of a joint ward round between the spinal team and the orthopedics team. So this was an initiative which was started by Dr. Atresh, but very well supported by the orthopedics team. It involved Dr. Atresh going up 2 times a week. And importantly, it was at the same time. And he would go up with members of his team, but would be joined by the orthopedic junior medical team, as well as the broader orthopedic multidisciplinary team. And they would go around and see all of the patients together. This started in September 2021 and is going to date. It has morphed somewhat over that period of time. So now what we're seeing is It's just once a week, but they have, again, a joint case conference on the orthopaedics ward where they discuss all the patients, and then a joint ward round, which follows that case conference. We were also able to secure $25,000 of specialist equipment, which was jointly funded by the Division of Surgery and the Division of Rehabilitation, which went a long way to, again, improving those resources that clinicians had to provide the care that they wanted. And we also created a purposely designed educational resource. And this had buy-in from both rehab and acute clinicians. And the purpose was just to try and provide an oversight on the key things that clinicians who don't have a lot of experience with dealing with spinal patients on the orthopaedics ward, what they should be focusing whilst they are on the orthopaedics ward, are waiting to be admitted into the spinal injuries unit. So if we go back now and kind of, again, look at those key issues that we identified in the thematic analysis, these solutions have gone a long way to really address most of these issues. So if we talk about those medical leadership, we now have a consultant who's going up every week and who is driving the care of these patients. And it also allows the team to be present so everyone's aware of the decisions that are being made. It also offers a really great educational opportunity for those non-specialist staff, and patients can now get that consistent information about their injury and about what to expect when they go into the spinal injuries unit. All those concerned about the processes, so the eligibility, the referral, the funding, again, all these now can be clarified during this ward round. So there is this now, a communication avenue where any questions can be resolved, which previously just didn't exist. And now, with the provision of the equipment and the educational resource, we have provided orthopaedic staff with a bit more capability to try and provide the care to these patients whilst they're spending extended periods on acute wards. And then if we look at the last point, we're now doing something that previously has never been done before. It's an innovative model of care. And it really, it allows both working groups to come together, join together, and try and provide the best care for their patients. So I think we can confidently say that we have gone a long way to achieving our aim, which was to try and improve their care to these patients whilst they're on the orthopaedics wards. A few acknowledgements. So obviously a huge thanks to the Hopkins Centre for funding both of these projects, but also to Tim Garrity from with the Division of Rehab, who's been extremely supportive of the whole project, and also the Division of Surgery, who helped out with funding the project right at the end as well. The research team was amazing. I couldn't have done it without them. And then also Dr. Atresh. So it was Dr. Atresh's idea at the start to approach this topic. And then again, he was instrumental in coming up with the solution to try and do the joint ward round. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you very much, Glenn. That was an excellent presentation. In fact, I'd like to thank all three presenters. I really feel that your talks really meshed with each other so nicely about the importance of capacity building in clinicians, and also the enormous value of clinician-led research. So before we get into the Q&A, I just wanted to reiterate that 2 of these projects were funded by seed grants and clinical fellowships, and to announce that we are very pleased to be offering the seed grant round and clinical fellowships opportunity in 2023. And we have been working on the development of guidelines so that people are very clear on the processes. And we will be releasing the guidelines for both the seed grants and the clinical fellowships in the next week. So we'll be sending an email out to all Hopkins members so that you can read up about these schemes. Think about it over Christmas, perhaps. And then we're going to be holding an information session towards the end of January, where there'll be an opportunity to ask questions about that. And that session will be recorded if people aren't back from leave. We'll then open up an expression of interest process, which will be due mid-February. So please keep this in mind and look out for that email. I think you can see from these 2 talks just the huge value of having that research support from a financial perspective and the time element. I also want to flag that we have PhD scholarship opportunities, which will be announced in the new year as well. So if anyone's thinking about a PhD and is looking, whether it's the right time now, that might be a nice incentive to take that plan to the next step. Okay, so now I'd like to open up the Q&A for this session, and we have a number of questions. So I might start with a question for you, Letty. So obviously your presentation was on medical officers' research capacity building. We're aware that you have done capacity building with other health professionals, and I was just wondering whether the barriers that medical officers expressed are similar to or a bit distinct from other health professionals such as nursing and allied health, and whether there's anything you can share more broadly from the other research that you've done in this space.
They are similar, Tamara. Nurses are just as time poor and just as perhaps underskilled, only because their focus is on clinical issues, and all those skills that you might have once had tend to be archived a bit. I can't say that we would use the same strategies. I think nurses work together a little bit more, whereas I think doctors tend to work a little bit more autonomously. But it's neither here nor there as to whether that's good or bad. And allied health professionals seem to be probably the best skilled that I've found so far amongst the clinicians. Yeah.
That's interesting. I think a number of them do like an honours degree as part of their training, and so perhaps that year with a dedicated research project might be something that contributes to that. What are the plans for future clinician capacity building, Letty? Have you got plans in store for next year?
We'd like to run the workshop again with medical officers, because it was a small and select group, because they just can't all go at once. It's very difficult to get off the floor. So we'd like to run that again, and perhaps like we found with the nursing research masterclass, the workshop structure and content might evolve a little bit as we hear feedback from people who use it and according to what their needs. But both the nursing workshop and the medical workshop are based on adult learning principles. So they come with knowledge, they come with skills, and we work on that, from that.
Great. I'll look forward to hearing about more opportunities next year where we build on that great work. And obviously Glenn and Karen are allied health professionals, and I think you could see their wonderful expertise with their research, and I'd just be curious to know what some of the main learnings have been for them throughout that process. So perhaps if we start with you, Karen, and you think back to where you were at the start of the process, what are some of the main learnings, or what have you valued the most from this process of undertaking this implementation focused research?
I think it's been really valuable to be able to add a research base to what we do clinically, and to say, you see so many projects where you develop a great clinical tool, but it's within a QI framework, and the research isn't there to really pass that tool on to someone else in a really formalized way. So I think that a key learning is having that lovely opportunity to develop that and then have that available for other people. I think too, for us, we were quite surprised at not the interest in our work, because we know this is a big area of need, but when we publicised our workshops, the interest was much stronger than we thought it would be. So for us, that demand is there, and how can we help fill that, and how can we help upskill people beyond us? And I think, I had a personal key learning of I should write a grant that does this rather than does this, because we always think that, we see 85 things we can try and make better for our clients, or how we work, and how we can scale that are probably things that I've personally learned as well.
Just seeing your research plan overview and how it unfolded, it was an incredibly ambitious seed grant project, and it just seemed to grow, and you just continued to build on it. And I'm just wondering how you managed that and juggled that with clinical work. Yeah,
it was stressful at times. I think having a great team around us. Yeah, and I think too that it was probably a much bigger grant a bigger project than we should have probably put in for. but I think our reasoning of doing it that way has resulted in such a lovely product.
I agree.
I think having that from Hopkins, that ability to have some longer timeframes, knowing that timeframes for publication have that flow-on effect to the next publication you're working from, which means our deadlines of wrapping up projects have been quite extended. And just that support here from our manager that sees the importance of contribution to industry and contribution to service development beyond our little backyard, that I think that it's been very much supported by that in-kind time support and juggling of priorities to try and get things wrapped up.
Yeah, congratulations, Karen. And I'm aware that you just finished the workshop yesterday, so you've just come off that experience of seeing how clinicians around Queensland are reacting to the framework. So any feedback that you've received that you're happy with?
Yeah, it went really, really well. And I think that feedback so far is that people just want more time, more discussion, not a 3-hour workshop. They want a 5-hour workshop. They want, they just want more. I think it's such a valuable thing that we can share. And I think we need to now look at that feedback and look at how else can we do that and how can we spread it beyond the southeast corner, looking at regional centres, looking at skill building beyond people who can travel down to South Bank.
Absolutely. So I was going to ask what your future plans are, continuing to disseminate. And
that's a really good question. I think we'd really like to run some more workshop series, but given the costs and fundings involved, we probably need to think about how we can do that strategically and in a way that can keep going for some time. And it would be and we've put in a proposal with another funding body to look at some funding to try and develop an online series to try and get that research out and get that translation project out. And I think our sitting down and talking about next research steps and looking at, well, what are the clinical outcomes of this change in practice? Yes. We've not formally evaluated that. So that's probably our next logical step. Given we have people for such a small amount of time, trying to show that is we'll have to pull you in, Tamara, bring in the big guns to help us try and plan that research out.
Yeah, that's terrific. So you've made incredible progress, but it's really just opened up now more questions and avenues that you feel quite compelled to explore because the traction that you've gained from this project. So congratulations. Glenn, I wanted to ask you as well what the experience of the clinical fellowship and the project that you developed, what the impact has been for you as well as your service, what you've learned along the way.
Yeah, thanks, Tamara. And I was the classic kind of, I think, example of what Hopkins is trying to do because I really didn't have a whole heap of research. I did do an honours as part of my undergraduate degree, but that was 10 years ago, and I really don't know how invested I was at the time with that. So the first thing I learned was you need to surround yourself with a really good team. And I was just really lucky. Letty, she used to joke at the start that she was my training wheels. And she actually was my training wheels. And she really just, guided me through, and really just gave me, and my whole team gave me the direction that I needed to go in. So that was the first thing. And I think without that team, I think you would just get lost and probably overwhelmed by it all. And the second thing, the biggest learning as well, doing the research was just the robustness of doing research, compared to doing what I would have normally done, which was just, a quality improvement task, and just realizing by taking it to that next level and just the quality increases so much more. And again, you just get that robustness of data, which I think then means you can just make such a more meaningful impact because you've got really good high quality data that you can kind of fall back on. So and look, and the real difficulties as well was just the ethics process and the governance process, and just kind of factoring those in, and the amount of time that it takes. And again, if you're a clinician and you're just used to being like, okay, got an idea, let's get a team, let's make it happen. But knowing in the research world, well, we need to then wait for the approval to come through, which can really take that time. So adjusting to that took some time as well.
Yeah. And having some protected time where you knew you were able to work through those processes, because I know some people initiate projects, but because of some of those obstacles and barriers, they can understandably lose heart along the way.
Exactly. Yes, would be very easily to do.
Yeah. So it sounds like you developed some wonderful research skills and understanding of different methodologies. Are you finding that you're able to pass that on and offer support to some of your colleagues that are also keen?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in the role that I'm doing now, even we wanted to do some patient interviews and just again, understanding what's involved in there, understanding, even just in the questions that you need to be considering, in the patient perspective, and then we move on to then the thematic analysis as well. And just wouldn't have had any idea of any of that before doing my clinical redesign study.
That's terrific. So yeah, the flow-on effects of, I think, investing in a clinical fellowship are far and wide for patients, the service, and the capacity building of the broader team. We're so pleased with these outcomes, Tim. Glenn, I have a question for you from Tim. Would you like to tell us where you think your work could go from here, Glenn? So what's next?
Yeah, well, look, we would love to do a formal evaluation onto this, because that's one thing where, again, we just ran out of time, and I think the impacts are obvious, but it would be really good to get that formalized, so we can really kind of see what impact we have. Because again, we hear reports that this is the best initiative in 15 years that people have been working in the orthopedics ward. So it'd be good to get to formalize that. The plan is also to publish that as well. But then we are kind of my work just ties in really nicely with a statewide project called BASCI that's going on at the moment. So I think the learnings that we've learned at a local level, kind of looking after the orthopedics ward, can be used with what QSIS are currently doing now. They've got a new team called Quick Start, which again is all about in-reaching, providing that care to those patients who are waiting to be admitted into the spinal injuries unit. So kind of using what we've learned there, embedding that into what QSIS Quick Start are doing as well.
Well, that sounds excellent. I'm really keen to have a chat to you further about that and to find out, how we could contribute or be involved in helping you with that evaluation. But congratulations, Glenn, on excellent outcomes of your clinical fellowship. You received an award last year recognising your skills and excellence in clinical translation. So we're extremely proud of all the projects that have been showcased in this session. So thank you very much to Letty and Karen and Glenn for their wonderful clinician capacity building and seed grant projects. I'd now like to draw session 2 to a close and thank our speakers, and also welcome the chair for the next session, session 3, where I get to take a little rest because I'm delighted to announce that my colleague, Professor Louise Gustafsson, will be the chair for session 3. Now, Louise is a valued research leader at the Hopkins Centre. She's supported and contributed for many years, and we're delighted that she's going to remain in a leadership role next year in the Enabling Technologies and Environments program, which is in fact the focus of session 3. So welcome, Louise, and thank you so much for chairing session 3.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tamara. I would like to formally welcome everyone to this third session, which is going to showcase some of the impact and outputs in that space of that research program within Hopkins around enabling technologies, environments, and citizen co-design. So I'm really thrilled to be chairing this session as it aligns with my change in moving into program lead around the Enabling Technologies and Environments program within the Hopkins Centre. We know that supporting people on the quality of the rehabilitation that people receive, but also around the systems and the environments and the supports that sit around them. So it's great for us to be able to showcase some of the work that's happening in this space within Hopkins, thinking about the environments and how we can support people better, but also what technology can introduce into these environments. So the next presentation that we're excited to hear about today is going to come first of all from the Habitech her PhD degree in biomedical engineering from Northwestern University, whilst working at the Rehabilitation Institute of Chicago. During her PhD, she investigated able-bodied and above-knee amputee balance recovery from tripping perturbations during walking. She was then a postdoctoral researcher in Zurich, where she was involved in studies using powered exoskeletons to better understand unimpaired walking and to restore locomotor function in people with spinal cord injury. She was also a researcher at the University of Zurich, where she studied the use of technology to support unsupervised gait training in stroke survivors. Her research interests are quite varied and include neuromuscular control of human gait and its application to rehabilitation, technology-based assessment of sensory motor function, and also translation of technologies into clinical and home environments. Camilla's going to be joined in her first presentation by Sue O, Paul Robinson, and Paul Robinson. Presentation, I'm sorry, but one moment, The second presentation today is going to be presented also by Camilla, working with Amelia Tan, who's a PhD placement fellow within the Hopkins Centre, and Kerry Anderson Kay and Vicky Mills from Metro South Health. They're going to present on SaboFlex Translation Implementation Project. And then our final presentation is going to be from Kelsey Chapman, who is working within the Dignity Project as the lead and who's a PhD candidate. This is a flagship program within the Hopkins Centre, and Kelsey is also the lead researcher on a new collaboration within the Department of Transport and Main Roads. Kelsey specialises in human rights research, disability research and rights, critical disability theory, and dignity theory. She's got extensive experience in ethics, governance, and data management and security, as well as supporting fellow researchers in project and research management. Kelsey's research interests therefore include the areas of human rights, ethics, dignity for people with disabilities, and critical disability theory. She is currently leading the Dignity Project, and will today discuss this project and how it is changing systems and attitudes to increase dignified outcomes for people with disability. Now, as per all other sessions, we're going to have an opportunity for questions at the end. So please, as you have been doing, please put any of your questions in using the Q&A function. But I would like to now welcome Dr. Camilla Shirota, Paul Robinson and Sue O to present their presentation for us.
Thanks, Louise. It looks like we might need to come a little bit closer. Sorry. Thanks everyone for joining us today, and I'll just hand over to Paul, who's going to take us away.
My name's Paul Robinson, and I'm one of the Happy Tech advisors, and I'm going to chat about inspiration connection through technology today, which is a topic that's probably pretty close to my heart. We had a focus group, and some of the issues that we saw were listed on the screen: the low uptake of technology, not knowing where to find information, how to use technology, opportunities to test and try, and wanting to use opportunities. These are all things that I've found through my personal experience of trying to find different accessible technologies and either having to modify equipment which is not suitable because they're just built for the general population. You find that nothing really works exactly the way it should because everyone's so different. It just, most things have to be modified to, actually be useful to me. Another thing is just getting access to equipment to trial. I was spent the last probably 2.5, 3 years trying to get a hand cycle, and I probably spent the first 18 months of that just trying to find a hand cycle I could trial, because without it, there was no chance I was getting funding. And because it was during COVID, no one could travel. I couldn't get to the hand cycle. They wouldn't send it up because of issues they'd had with postage and that. And it's just, it was a very difficult process to get through. and very stressful by the end. And then once you get to NDIS, then you have to, you know, jump through all their hoops. So it's been a very long process. Yeah, sorry.
So based on kind of some of these ideas that the needs that were identified before, and also some of the thoughts around what Paul was explaining to us previously, the team got together and came up with this concept that we call Habitech. It aims to do two main things, which is increase the accessibility of already available technology, but also building a culture of citizen-led design so that we make sure that we focus on developing new tools that address what people need and want. So to do that, we kind of sit over three main pillars, which is, again, the citizen-led problem solving. We also rely on clinicians to help us identify the needs and advise along the way. And lastly, really jumping on top of opportunities that technology enable to us to be able to address some of these problems. So a lot of those are all great ideas, but what does this look like in practice? So these are a few examples of what we've been able to do. And sorry for that text going over a little bit. In practice, that means that we're connecting lots of different interdisciplinary teams. So these are just examples of a few of the projects that we've had over the years. I'm not going to go into details, but really the important bits are that these are either issues identified by the clinicians inside of the hospital or issues identified for specific patients. And we've been able to reach out and leverage knowledge and expertise from people that can help us navigate these problems either in a different way, in a new way, or even for the first time. So for example, we've been able to connect with 3D printing specialists and at Griffith University, as well as people that can help us build apps or programs or do virtual reality-based things from the School of Information and Communication Technology. Also reaching out to industry, so people that can build devices that are medically certified to be able to use in a clinic or in people's homes, as well as even connecting within the same discipline, people that professionals that have different focus. So for example, the OT team from the PA, as well as OT academics from UQ. And you'll hear a little bit more about how we did that in the next presentation. As far as research is concerned, so we try to take that model and kind of expand it even further, either going through reaching out to more people with lived experience, and also not just inside the hospital, but across the rehab continuum, if you will, so people that are out in the community. Also reaching out to other stakeholders, so designers, engineers of all different types of flavors, funders, to really try to figure out how we can address some of the issues that Paul had talked about before. And industry also, of course. And you can't really see it in this picture, unfortunately, but that's kind of also bringing even projects that aren't really mature yet, and bringing clinicians and people with disability and all these other stakeholders in an earlier point, so that we can start addressing some of these issues in very early stages and kind of bring those collaborators with us throughout the whole process. And then just finally, what we've been working on is trying to document and structure all of that through a co-design framework. So it's really about mapping the stakeholders that are involved, their level of engagement, and over which development phases of a technology. And we hope that this will be a tool that can help people plan, reflect, but also evaluate how they did their co-design.
So we, as part of our research studies, we interviewed some participants who came to the Habitech lab, and that was a pilot project, to see them, to get some feedback. Found that people had an overall improved wellbeing, felt that having people and resources to go through their use of technology, it was like somebody turned on the sun. And they also had lots of constructive feedback in terms of, we could really do more in this space, and we want to do more in this space. We did also interview some clinicians as well, and that's yet to be analysed and published. We just got a little clip of Justin, who's also another one of our Habitech ambassadors, and he's done a lot in this space. And this is just Justin highlighting the importance and how valuable Habitat has been here.
Good evening, everyone. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which I live, the Yagara people, and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Ever since Sue asked me one fateful day at the PA, my involvement at Habitat has been quite fulfilling. The Habitat team and I have created articles about eye gaze technology, as well as the Codstick adaptive controller, which I rely on almost every day. The Habitat website allows information and assistive technology solutions to be shared, as well as potential solutions to problems. Further, the Habitat Lab provides an opportunity for people apprehensive to try new technologies to connect with a knowledgeable team and comfortably test it out for themselves. They can then decide whether or not it is right for their individual needs before buying it or applying for a funding application. Personally, during my early days of disability, I was not in the right mindset to be imagining and selecting which assistive technologies were going to be effective. So I believe having a space to test and demonstrate will be very beneficial to others. Next year, I hope we can innovate new ideas and solutions in the Habitat space, as well as connect and collaborate with others. Thank you.
For those that know Justin and has known him for some years, I think hopefully that was as impactful as it was for me when I heard that. So I guess from Habitat, I guess that was a bit of a reflection on some of the things that we've been doing in the last few years. In terms of next steps for us, I feel like we've learned a lot during this time. And we've also learned that connecting with the interdisciplinary team when we're looking at using technology, and as Paul mentioned, about access to funding, policies, and how we navigate that space is really important so that people can have access to the right technologies and also have the expertise to guide in terms of what is available and what could be modified. Opportunities to trial and test, which is also something that Paul's also mentioned, and I guess we've had lots of success in the coming try days. We've been through some in-services or demonstrations where we've been able to interact with the technologies to see how that would be important for each of the clinicians in their clinical space, but also for people, how that might be beneficial for them, for people with different types of disabilities. And also being able to share experiences with like-minded people, connecting with people who are really interested in the same things, what else is possible, how we can put our heads together so that we can write a business case to get funding approved to have something in the rehab space. So I guess those sorts of things are things that we have really valued during this process. And some exciting things to kind of look forward to is that our Home to Hospital project, which some of you would be familiar with, that project will have a bit of a focus within Hopkins in the next couple of years. Camilla's done lots of work in the co-design framework with lots of people in this space, so look out for that because I think that will really put a lot of structure to what we're trying to do. And of course, there's obviously always some ongoing scoping for a physical space where people can all come together to be able to interact and make those connections. So if anyone has any questions or if people want to kind of think about, well, where we want to go next, I think a lot of you would know where to find us. And Camilla's also in the Hopkins Centre office once a week at the PA just to kind of get some more presence out there as well. So if you're unsure, you can always talk to one of us too. Thank you. And I'd just like to just hand over to Camilla again for the SavoFlex Rehab Device Translation and Implementation Project.
Thank you, Sue. Team, you guys are going to see some shuffling around because we're having a bit of a party here at the PA, but I just wanted to introduce our next project, which is talking about implementing the SavoFlex for upper limb neuro rehab and clinical practice at the PA. This was a great project around Habitat and how we like to work and the type of work that we like to do. It started off with the PA OT team reaching out to us. They had acquired some equipment, but as we all know, they're very, very busy, have lots of work going on. and didn't have the opportunity to be able to figure out how to implement it in practice. So we got very lucky that Amelia, who is a PhD student at UQ, reached out to us as well, looking for a placement. It was just the perfect project for the perfect person. We put that together, and in this presentation, Amelia is going to tell us a little bit about what she did, and then Carrie Ann and Vicky, who are the clinicians from the PA, will tell us what happened after that. So take it away, Amelia.
I'll first briefly explain what the SableFlex is. So if you could still show the slides from Camilla, please. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so it's a non-robotic dynamic wrist hand orthosis for people with little to no distal upper limb movement. The SableFlex uses springs to maintain thumb and finger extension, and this helps the wearer to achieve an assisted but functional grasp and release. So this here is an overview of my PhD industry placement project. There were 3 key components. The first was a literature review examining the effectiveness and feasibility of using SableFlex for upper limb rehabilitation. I also did benchmarking with other Australian clinical services about how they use SableFlex in practice, and developed several practical resources to support the PAOTs to implement SableFlex in their practice. For the literature review, I conducted a systematic search in these databases and in grey literature. And I found 23 papers that related to the SableFlex, published between 2005 and 2022. Majority of these papers use SableFlex with people with stroke. There were 4 main categories of findings, and I'll do just a quick summary of each. So SableFlex use generally resulted in positive upper limb outcomes for patients, but more high quality evidence is needed. I also summarized the descriptions of the SableFlex therapy programs used in these papers to help the PA therapists understand what sort of therapy programs worked and how they were done. This included information like the session duration and frequency of SableFlex use, example training activities, and how task progression occurred. SableFlex was found to be feasible to use in clinical practice. Patients and therapists reported that the SableFlex use resulted in direct upper limb benefits and generalized benefits. However, the fitting of the device was challenging. I also summarized findings from 2 papers reporting on patients, caregivers, and clinicians' perspective of assistive technology, including SableFlex, but in view of time, I won't elaborate on this today. During the placement, I also reached out to 4 senior occupational therapists who were already using SableFlex as part of the clinical services they ran for upper limb neurorehabilitation. 3 were from tertiary hospitals and 1 from a community private practice. I held 1-hour semi-structured interviews with each of them to gather their experiences of using SableFlex in practice. I asked them about the client population they used it with, including which types of clients showed the most clinical benefit. I also asked about whether there was multidisciplinary team involvement and how staff were trained to fit and use SableFlex. Other questions asked included the SableFlex training programs they used and outcomes they've noticed from using SableFlex with their patients. In summary, the integrated findings about SableFlex from the literature review and benchmarking are that it's a feasible and useful therapy tool for upper limb neurorehabilitation. It appears to be generally effective in improving patient outcomes and offers generalized benefits on top of the direct upper limb benefits. However, the fitting and adjusting of SableFlex is a complex and time-consuming task. Therefore, ongoing training of clinicians is key, as is the education and ongoing follow-up with patients. I developed several practical resources for the PA hospital. Firstly, a screening and referral form with pictures to streamline their referral process of potentially eligible patients to SABLE-trained therapists. I also did a measurement and sizing form so that allied health assistants could do the measurement and use the sizing information to start building the SableFlex components for an eligible patient, thereby reducing therapist time during the initial fitting. I created a SableFlex training documentation template, making sure that it followed similar structure and format to an existing documentation form that the PA therapists were already using for upper limb therapy. And lastly, I did some patient education handouts each for SableFlex and SableReach for therapists to give to eligible patients. I compiled all of the above into a final practical resource and report for the Hopkins Centre, which we hope to publish. I also presented my work and findings to several PA clinicians and the clinicians who participated in the benchmarking. I'll now hand over to Carrie and Vicky, who will share more about the clinical impacts, benefits, and future opportunities of using the SableFlex.
So Kerry and I would just like to briefly touch on the impacts and benefits of the project to date, starting off with a bit of a patient example. So if you want to just meet Mal here, Mal was actively involved as our patient expert throughout the resource design process. In this first video, we will press play one more time on that one. We can see him trying to actively extend his fingers and control his upper limb movement to pick up a ball. And you can see he's having quite a lot of difficulty with that. In the second video here, you can see him trying to do the same task using the Sabo Flex. And he did this repetition for about 20 minutes. And then on the third video, you can actually see some immediate carryover once that Sabo Flex was removed. And all of that was within one session, probably only his second session ever using the Sabo Flex. So I'll just hand over to Kerry now, who will keep talking about some of these benefits that we've seen.
So I think the benefits to the service and to our stroke patient cohort since the conclusion of the placement have really gone beyond what we initially anticipated. Sabo is now consistently utilised in our group and one-to-one treatment sessions, and we're moving towards a plan for competency training with our therapy assistants to help with some of that measuring and fitting to really optimise the therapist intervention time. We found that the Sabo has actually been a really effective adjunctive therapy tool for our patient cohort who have more severe motor impairment, which has really allowed them to engage in our activity-based upper limb rehab model earlier in their rehab admission than would have perhaps been possible previously. And that's been really motivating for them as they're able to engage in our groups model earlier and spend time with other stroke-impacted peers. So whilst COVID has impacted the rehab space like everywhere else, particularly within our group treatment model, Sabo has been able to be used for patients who've remained in isolation to continue to progress their upper limb rehab when they've been unable to attend groups or access the treatment gyms, really helping to build that required intensity of practice towards achieving their functional upper limb goals. In terms of how that's sort of translated outside of our immediate project team and setting, it's not only being used as an inpatient treatment modality, but also we're using it as trial equipment to justify ongoing access to upper limb management through NDIS plans. And Mal's a really great example of a patient that utilised the Sabo whilst he was an inpatient, obtained funding for ongoing provision within his NDIS plan, attended our day hospital groups program utilising the Sabo, and then transitioned to management under his NDIS therapist, with a direct continuation of his therapy program and activity goals that had been developed for his home context. So this process has sort of mitigated some of the application and effectiveness barriers that were highlighted through Amelia's original literature review and has really helped to maintain his momentum and gains. So this translation of the approach across our inpatient groups, day hospital, and then into the NDIS setting is leading to just really more impactful application of this as a therapy tool and translation to functional use, which from an OT perspective is always our key goal. In terms of the benefits of this collaborative approach that we've had with Hopkins, I think the clinical knowledge of the treating team and the identified project objectives coupled with Amelia's academic prowess was really a winning combination for us. And we were genuinely blown away by the volume of output that she generated in the short placement window. I think the time-limited nature of the placement and the shared accountability kept all parties on track and really allowed clinicians to prioritise the time that was required to progress in the project space, and sometimes that can get lost under clinical pressures. In reality, despite having the Sabo kit available for use, progressing the clinician accreditation, development of all the associated clinical documentation, guidelines and patient education materials would have become a protracted and constantly deprioritised task in the current clinical climate, meaning that we really wouldn't be getting the consistent clinical benefit of the treatment tool that we had available. I think also having access to a clinical environment with motivated clinicians and a willing patient cohort allowed for real-time trial and adjustment of the resources that were being developed. And it allowed for the screening and fitting tools, the sessional documentation, patient education to be integrated into the existing OT rehab processes. And I think by overlaying those resources with our existing goal setting and upper limb intervention and education formats, it has allowed for really rapid adoption by clinicians outside of the project team and minimise the change management processes that we needed to go through for both the OT and the MDT teams. Within the placement timeline, we arranged for all placement partners to attend shared external training through SABO to really optimise all of our knowledge of the technology and to support realistic application in the clinical setting. And lastly, in terms of, I guess, future directions, we'll certainly be looking to support Amelia in publication of the work she's completed in this space to date and really fostering this ongoing collaborative relationship with Hopkins. The benefit, I think, to ourselves as treating clinicians and to our patients is really evident, and the learning for us perhaps in moving forward will likely to be even bolder in our ideas and to approach this collegiate space with less caveats and restrictions in mind to what actually might be achievable. And I think that brings us to our thank yous for all of the people that we've partnered with, and I would like now to hand over to Hopkins Project, Kelsey Chapman. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. That was amazing. It's great to see what is possible when clinical and research come together. So just want to congratulate my colleagues there. As the team said, I'm Kelsey Chapman from the Dignity Project. I'm the academic research lead and a PhD candidate at Griffith. So I'm presenting today solo, but I, of course, work with an amazing team here at Hopkins and across Griffith, including citizen researchers with disability, Professor Elizabeth Kendall, and some amazing research fellows and research assistants as well. Just a little bit about what the past 5 years has looked like for the Dignity Project. We obviously come together as a research initiative with 4 different studies across the 4 to 5 year period. We do a lot of partnerships, so that's both with industry, Queensland government, of course, with Metro South Health and Gold Coast Health and the Motor Vehicle Accident Insurance Commission. And then we do advisory and support for citizen researchers and for people within the Hopkins Centre and Griffith more broadly who are looking to partner with citizen researchers in their own work. A little bit about our approach to the conceptualization of disability. We come from a human rights perspective, which might be a bit different than a typical clinical context. We adhere to the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability to recognize that disability comes from an interaction or a mismatch between impairment and environment. So some of the work that we do, we aimed to uncover what dignity means and how it's experienced by people with disability in interaction with mainstream systems and services. So that included public transport, healthcare and clinical environments, as well as inclusion in the community and employment. We explicated some of those barriers and enablers and partnered with citizen researchers with disability using a citizen science framework, which we're very happy to say has been published in the Australian Journal of Occupational Therapy in their most recent special issue. This is a 5-stage framework, and I won't bore you with it because I'm sure many of you are familiar with it or have heard me talk about it previously. But I think the most important thing is what's come out of this framework is that our citizen researchers and the people that they interact with feel really dignified and included in our studies. Some of the background that participants have shared with us and citizen researchers about the importance of dignity. You might be thinking, why should we be studying this? Participants said you feel not worthy. To be honest, you feel like less than a human when you're treated without dignity. And what we started to uncover over the course of these various studies is that dignity is something that people without disability take for granted, and it's something we assume that we have. And especially amongst people with acquired impairment, they shared with us this kind of before and after, where after acquiring their impairment, they realized that dignity might not be something that they are necessarily getting all the time. The importance of studying dignity is, of course, it's established in different human rights frameworks and legislations across Australia and internationally. Specifically in a health context, it enables the optimal delivery of preventative service and preventative care. And a number of our citizen researchers shared with us the fear that comes from interacting with the health service system when you're not treated with dignity, and how that can actually delay seeking preventive care and increase hospitalization or length of stay. It's also an upstream determinant of quality of life and an important marker of inclusion and participation. One of our participants defined dignity as, I think, of respect, independence, the right to choose, the right to voice an opinion, a right to live as desired, a right to be heard, a right to request support and assistance, a right to listen, taste, smell, feel, and enjoy, a right to express emotions, a right to empathy, sympathy, individuality, a right to be different, unique, unconventional, a right to fresh air, water, food, sleep, sunlight, and freedom. So you can see dignity for lots of people has a variety of meanings. And so that was one of the first challenges as we set out on this kind of forced study journey, was how do we take something that's so broad, so personal and subjective, and distill it into ways that are practicable and implementable for clinicians and for service providers. And so what we boiled it down to is what we say is our working definition. Dignity is the acknowledgement of people with disability as humans with value, agency, and preferences, which then requires the delivery of their human rights in ways that are responsive and respectful to those preferences. So that's a lot of words, and we recognize that. And so we started to unpack this idea of acknowledgement. It was shared across all of our studies by more than 25 participants. Most of our participants were predominantly female with physical impairment. However, we did collect data from a diverse participant pool, and everyone touched on, or most people touched on, this idea of acknowledgement. And the fact that systems and service providers can acknowledge. So we started to go down that track of what does that actually mean? So acknowledgement is the acceptance of the truth or the existence of something. So really fundamentally, it's just about recognizing the worth and value of all people, which of course we know is something that is often denied to people with disability. It's not necessarily about respect, because I don't need to respect you to treat you with dignity if I'm just acknowledging you as a human. Ultimately, it's about the delivery of human rights in ways that are respectful to all people's preferences. Now, as I said, we started to uncover the fact that systems, service providers, mainstream services can acknowledge people with disability in ways that promote and protect their dignity. And there's 4 key areas in which people can do that, people and systems. So first, dignity is experienced when the built and virtual environments and accessible and inclusive design overlapped in ways that made participants feel welcome and included. And this isn't just about the design of a house or a ramp, it's about the holistic environment. We have participants who shared with us that we live in such a hostile environment. The built environment is so driven by risk management and limits. It's not human-centered. For this participant, a hospital is a really hostile environment because it's noisy and bright. So it's extending this idea about accessible and inclusive design beyond just kind of the tangible things that we think about, although they're very important as well, and really approaching it holistically and also the whole journey. So what happens when someone leaves their home, when they get on public transport, when they get to the hospital or the clinic or the service that they're accessing, what happens in that built environment all the way to the way home. That's all impacting on their dignified experience. Independent access to information that can be used, that can be accessed easily, and as I said, independently, and can be used reliably to support sense making.
And this means more than just, here's how you get from point A to point B, or when you come to your clinical appointment, this is what's going to happen to you today. It's actually about people with disability being able to gather information, understand how that's going to impact them, and then they can make a decision. Do I want to go to that appointment? Is this clinic or service something that's going to be inclusive and dignified for me? Or perhaps I want to look for a different provider. Or this train station is only accessible one way, and so I might use a different train station as my set off and return station. So it's being able to not just get the information, but use it in ways that are individually beneficial so that a person with disability can protect their own dignity. Empathic attitudes. Across every study that we did, all of our participants mentioned the importance of frontline service providers and frontline staff interacting in respectful and empathic ways. Of course, it increased dignity when people with disability were supported in the ways that they wanted, not in the ways that other people thought they might need support, respectfully, calmly, and in ways that showed empathy. And we found that individually, different frontline service providers and clinicians have different opportunity to do this. They have different capability and different motivation for interacting empathically. And ultimately, organizational pressures are, of course, limiting the opportunity for staff to interact in those respectful and empathic ways that increase dignity. All the staff that we spoke to are really believe in the importance of dignity, especially in a clinical setting. It's just what opportunity do they have? And of course, we know that clinician burnout is at an all-time high, and that, of course, subsequently impacts on patients as well. And finally, our other key piece of acknowledging people with disability is voice, choice, and independence. So often people with disability are told what's happening, or information is hidden from them, or they're asked about, goal setting, for example. But ultimately, that's in a very confined or bounded mechanism. And so just creating the opportunity for specifically patients to express their preferences and then discuss that with them was a really important part of maintaining dignity and furthering that idea of acknowledgement. And just to leave you with a final quote from one of our citizen scientists, they said, "I experience moments that lack dignity daily, specifically by other people or poorly designed places and objects from multiple disciplines, from health professionals who know or should know and understand diagnoses and symptoms." And this sort of leads into what we're doing next. After the 4 studies that we did, thanks to MACE and our other partners, we are now undertaking a study at Gold Coast Health, specifically in their rehabilitation department, to understand how this can be applied really specifically in a clinical, but even more specifically in a ward context, and start to co-design with patients and staff some of those ways that that system might be able to better acknowledge people with disability or patients undergoing rehab or rehabilitation-like care in order to establish dignity as a clinical facet of care rather than this kind of non-clinical soft facet. So that's among some of the things that are coming soon. And we just want to say thank you to, of course, Tamara and Elizabeth Kendall, Kevin, Angel, Dinesh, all of our citizen scientists and all of the wonderful researchers at Hopkins who have really supported this work and helped us to get to where we are today. So thank you very much. And I'll now hand back to Louise.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kelsey. I would like to extend thanks to all of our presenters in that session. So to Camilla, Sue, Paul, Amelia, Kerry-Ann, Vicky and Kelsey, thank you so much for really interesting presentations and sharing your insights, outcomes and impact with us. I think something that struck me with all of those presentations, which is really, I guess, the core of the ethos of Hopkins, is that power of collaboration and also developing the frameworks or the ways for doing that well, not just saying that we're going to collaborate with people, but actually really doing the work to identify ways for people to do it well so that it is authentic and having these fantastic outcomes. That was great to hear. We do have opportunities for some questions. So please, I've got some here for me and I've certainly got some, but if you have any questions for any of those speakers, please pop those through in the question and answer function. But I might kick off first of all and start with the first presentation, and I'm not sure who's going to answer what questions, so I'm not going to identify people by name. I'm going to let that be a bit of a lottery. One of the first questions I think around the HabiTech project is to really ask and think about what do you see would be next for this project for HabiTech? What would be the ideal moving forward for you as a team?
I think having like a physical space with this opportunity for those interdisciplinary teams to work directly with patients at the beginning, to have a look at different ways to create solutions or opportunities, or to be able to demonstrate what's possible, I think will be so valuable, because sometimes when people leave the centre into the community, I think things are a bit different and changing now, but it's often difficult to make those connections. And I've learned that having connections and connecting with people who are really interested in this space and also willing to learn from each other has been really valuable to start projects, to put our heads together, to get funding for things, to move and shake. It's difficult to get access to some of these things at the best of times anyway. So I think that's really valuable. I don't know what you think, just in terms of, what's kind of happening in real life. Sometimes the hospital's not a real life situation. It is real for the clinicians day to day, but for people in these situations, what are some of the challenges and what could make some of those paths a bit more easier?
I think right that sex, like getting together and seeing other people in the real world actually doing things and how they progress, and not just hearing a story about it, or hearing of someone I knew who knew someone who did this is very
yeah. And I think having people who have that level of expertise of lived experience, and this is what I did, and the value of that in the mix for someone who's just starting to have a look at what's possible, I think that's really valuable too.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm wondering, I'm sitting here wondering if you have got some examples of what you could explain. We've heard about the impact, but what are some of the work that you've done, the personalised solutions that you've found for individuals, just to give the audience a sense of what types of things you're talking about that you're doing in HabiTech?
Like a quick, easy one, that's a frustrating thing on a day-to-day setup, could be around wheelchair setup.
Yep.
And I'm sure for those who've set up wheelchairs, it's incredibly time-consuming, and it can also be quite an experience for the person having their chair set up. Just how complicated it is, and what a wheelchair can symbolise can also be quite confronting too. And then one of the big things is, for them, once that setup's complete, then how am I going to drive it, and how can I drive it well? Because I want to feel confident and feel competent to be able to do that and not run into walls, because that's also a very undignified process too. So we did this project with Adapt to make those joystick covers. I used one this week actually, and it needs modification. So I need to link up with Camilla again to see what we can do about that. But to make like a joystick controller that's quite customised for that individual, so that they can do that, they can drive that chair well and confidently. So the ADAPT team, they're Derek, they're down at the Gold Coast at Griffith University, and they had access to 3D printers and different designs, and they were able to fabricate something for us. And also work with the individual to make it out of silicone that could be washable in the dishwasher. Something really basic like that. That was very practical. So that was really interesting, I think, for everybody in that team, because we learned a lot from each other, and highlighted the difference in language and difference in priorities, but also just knowing that we're all kind of aiming towards the same thing. So that was a wonderful learning experience, and that was a good outcome in terms of what that person was able to do.
Fantastic, thank you. I might come back to you, but I'm just going to move along to Amelia and Carrie-Anne and Vicky and Camilla and just ask some questions about the SaboFlex project, because I think that's a really wonderful demonstration of how people from a range of different organisations to come together to really meet a really important outcome. SaboFlex obviously is something you'll know that I've been a little bit interested in around the impact of it and how it is incorporated and received by people following stroke and as they return to home. What would be the advice? I know you certainly talked about finding the collaboration and having that assistant was really important, but what would your advice be to other teams who are thinking about incorporating this or doing something similar with another device?
I think one of the key things that has been a benefit to us is to have a really good understanding of our model of care for managing that particular domain, that whatever device you're implementing is trying to address, and ensuring that whatever implementation pathway and process you follow is interconnected with that. Because I think the challenge with a lot of these initiation of new devices that we use in health is actually getting the sustainability plan right and getting it adopted more broadly than the project team. So, I think as clinicians, we're all passionate about various parts of practice. And if you have that person there that can continue to drive and push, then that's great. But the reality with attrition and movement in the health workforce is that often those specialists do move to other places. And unless you've really embedded those processes well, it will peter out, because even just finding the available time to deliver the intervention, let alone to ask other people to deliver intervention in a certain way, is challenging. And I think the approach, having Amelia obviously as a clinician background as well, and her knowledge of upper limb management in general, but being able to say, these are the processes we use for our groups, this is how we document, this is the framework that we do our education in, and all of the resources slot in with that. They're not a new process, a different process, they just are sort of seamlessly integrated into that. The other therapists coming through have been able to pick it up really quickly.
Great.
And that's one of the strengths of the project, is being able to bring together, a lot of this in-depth clinical understanding, and how do we take what we found in the literature and be able to, overlay that over, which is what Amelia did so well, is a bit critical to going from that research space into something that's a bit more applied.
Amelia, if I can ask you, the incorporating an industry placement within your HDR and working with teams like this, what would you say are the benefits, and from your experience, what would you share?
Yeah, I would totally recommend it to anyone who's thinking about doing it. Because I think it really certainly gives you a break from doing your PhD, which I think from doing your actual thesis, which I think a lot of PhD candidates might appreciate, just having the mind space to think about something else. But then it's related because it's still in an area of interest. I think for me as well, having while working with Carrie and Vicky and Camilla, just being able to connect with lots of different I guess people from different organizations. So working with Camilla and Tamara, so people who come from different disciplinary backgrounds as well. And then working with clinicians and seeing how all of our work together can kind of integrate well together. And then I think hearing from Kerry and Vicky as well about how it has been really helpful to them. I think that's been very, very encouraging and very motivating. I think not just in terms of completing the placement and, you know, doing it well, but I think just overall and thinking of like doing a PhD. I guess the reason why we do it is ultimately we're interested in research, and particularly for me, I'm interested in clinical research. So I think this has been a great opportunity to see how like your work can really make a difference to patients, and that's something that I hope to eventually do as well when I finish my PhD.
Fantastic, lovely, thank you. And Kelsey, finally, over to you. Thank you so much for sharing all that information about the Dignity Project. It's such a wonderful and important project. So congratulations on that body of work. You talked a little bit about what the next steps were going to be, but I'm wondering what would be, from the work that you've done and from the learnings from the project, what would be some really good take-home practical ways and practical messages that people could take away from the presentation about how to better acknowledge the value of lived experience in our research?
Yeah, I think we started with that at the very beginning. So that citizen science framework, we actually spent about 6 months at the beginning of the project developing that. And that, to me, has been probably the best work that we've done, and really important for setting the trajectory of the work to both have impact and meaning. So I think for any researcher, my advice would be to talk to someone from the community that you're researching and get them on board with your project. Ask them if the questions you're asking are even relevant to them, or what is so important about your work. It's just so, it's a privilege really to talk to people about their own lived experience and then be able to work together to actually ensure that your work is having impact on the people who you're hoping to impact the most. And I think it also has made this kind of like translation, you know, of course, like pubs and all that's very important, and we need to do that. But ultimately, the goal of our research was to have some translatable impact. And so grounding it in those perspectives of lived experience means that we're able to do that in a better way, I think. So that's kind of like my first advice. And also, don't be afraid to just try it. I think Camilla and I know a few other people at the Hopkins Centre, like it's very daunting, or it feels very daunting to start out on this co-design or citizen engagement journey. And you learn so much just by doing. So I think if you're thinking about doing it, just go for it and reach out to any of us, and we can tell you about all the ways we've failed and learned over the past, 4 years. And but just try it and do a bit of research and then go for it, because it really is one of the best things that you will do.
Fantastic, thank you. I would like to take this moment to again give a great round of thanks to all of our presenters in this session, and thank you to everyone for the questions and for the answers that you've provided for those today. I would like to now hand back over to Tamara, who's going to make some announcements, Hopkins Award announcements, and the closing statement for today. Over to you, Tamara.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Louise. That was beautifully chaired and such a stimulating and interesting session. I always get really engrossed when I see technology research and videos of real life impacts of research. So thank you. Just to reiterate Louise's thanks to those presenters. So now we're moving on to an exciting part of the proceedings where we get to recognise some of the outstanding achievements of our researchers. So we have 4 awards that I'd like to announce, and these were to be announced at the Meet and Mingle event earlier this month, but unfortunately we needed to postpone the Meet and Mingle, which is a face-to-face event due to a rise in COVID cases. But we are looking to hold the Meet and Mingle event again in February, where we will get to re-acknowledge all of the awardees and put them back in the spotlight. So the first award that I would like to announce is the Citizen Research Impact Award. And this award recognises the achievements of a citizen researcher who has, through research, made a major difference to the lives of people with disability. And I'm delighted to announce that this year this award goes to Dr. Gary Allen. Now, this award recognises Gary's tireless advocacy for people with disability and life-changing initiatives he has led, such as Enabled VIP, an employment entrepreneurship platform, which was launched officially this week. So Gary is aware of his award and he's asked me to say just a few words. Disability does not need to limit entrepreneurial potential or capacity, but isolation and prejudice can if we let them. Enabled VIP is a novel and innovative approach to disability employment in Australia. It is led and guided by Australian business people with disability. All Australians with disability, their carers, and those with an established connection to disability in Australia can join the platform. To find out more details about Enabled VIP and Gary's project, we'll be providing this in the next Hopkins wrap. So congratulations, Gary, and thank you for your tireless efforts and achievements. Congratulations once again. Okay, so the next award is for early career research achievements. So this award recognises early achievements in research relative to career opportunity. And I'm delighted to announce that the awardee or the recipient is Mike Norwood. So Mike is the project manager of Diamond, a research project on virtual reality and spatial neglect funded by NHMRC. Mike also recently completed his PhD on the impact of nature on young people with disability. This award recognises his research excellence, productivity and leadership in technology and neuropsychology early in his career. Mike has also asked me to say a few words. So Mike has expressed, I'm very grateful to receive this award on behalf of the whole Diamond project team. The concept of the project started with the clinicians at Gold Coast, and they have been present at each stage. They even managed to keep the project going throughout COVID. The concept was established and refined by Professor Heidi Zeman and Dr. David Painter, and he acknowledges their leadership. He also wants to acknowledge the skills and contributions of Chelsea Marsh, Michaela Kerr and the support team, and finally the leadership and mentorship from Professor Elizabeth Kendall and Dr. Ali Lakhani. So thank you, Mike. It's such a delight to have you as a researcher in the Hopkins Centre, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. Okay, the third award is the Clinical Translation Award, and this award recognises research that has driven changes in practice and service delivery. And this year, I'm excited to announce that the award goes to Dr. Karen Water, and Karen presented earlier. So Karen is the clinical lead for ABI TRS, and this award recognises her leadership of research that has transformed practice. Karen and her colleagues have developed and implemented an evidence-based vocational rehabilitation framework. She has also established clinician training workshops to promote the broader uptake of this framework into practice to improve vocational outcomes of people with brain injury. Congratulations, Karen. Karen would like me to say a few words on her behalf. She would like to say thank you to the Hopkins Centre for the funding opportunities which have allowed this work to happen, and thanks also to her manager, Arity Kennedy, for supporting these not small projects with ongoing time from TRS. I'm so pleased our work is being recognised and is found to be useful, and acknowledge that this is the work of our entire vocational team here at ABI TRS. Thank you, Karen, and congratulations. Okay, the final award is the Research Champion Award. And this award is quite a broad one, recognising engagement in research and the support of others to undertake research. So this year, the award goes to Rachel Jones. So Rachel Jones is a clinical nurse consultant in the Spinal Injuries Unit at the Division of Rehabilitation, and also Senior Research Manager for TRACE and CRISIS, which are two large longitudinal cohort studies that Rachel works across. This award recognises Rachel's superb research management skills, particularly her knowledge and application of ethics, governance and research integrity, and also the support she provides to our research fellows and research assistants involved in these projects. So thank you and congratulations, Rachel, and to all of our 4 awardees. You will be, as I said, put back in the spotlight in February, because it's so much nicer to make these awards in person. So we look forward to seeing you at the meet and mingle in February to again recognise these achievements. So I also want to, on behalf of the Hopkins Centre, say a huge thank you to all of our presenters. I think it was a really diverse, engaging program that was presented today across such different topics and applications. So thank you to all of our speakers, and also thank you to the audience for your engagement and participation. I want to express my thanks to Louise Gustafsson for her expert chairing of session 3, and also say a huge thank you to Michaela Kerr, who is behind the scenes and has just made today possible, and the attention to detail that goes into a program like today is phenomenal, and Michaela and her support team have been excellent, so thank you very much. And finally, I'd like to thank the media, the audiovisual team, so JPL. Thank you very much for coping with all of our details and questions and technology concerns. Thank you to Jamie and the team. Now, stepping back for a moment, I just want to reflect on how the research that we achieve and the outcomes and the impacts of the Hopkins Centre would not be possible without our people and our partners. So we are extremely fortunate to have a really diverse, engaged membership, which includes people with lived experience, clinicians, academics and industry partners. And I'd like to express our sincere gratitude for your support and contributions over the past 5 years. And we really look forward to continuing these meaningful collaborations with you in the future as we embark on the next 5 years of research. So I just want to briefly wrap up by talking a bit about the future. So at the Hopkins Centre, we are very proud to be at the forefront of consumer-driven and translation-focused research. Over the last 5 years, we have conducted over 100 collaborative projects, some of which, only some, could be showcased today. And we have supported clinicians and consumers to not only be involved in research, but to drive projects in areas that matter. Over the next 5 years, we'll continue to build the capacity of our flagship programs and strengthen our links with the decision makers who can apply our research to bring about changes in clinical practice, service delivery, policy and community attitudes. We really value the important partnership between Metro South Health and Griffith University, and we'll continue to strengthen these collaborations in the future. And both of our organisations are very grateful to the Motor Accident Insurance Commission for our ongoing partnership and the opportunity that MACE provides for us to make such an impact on the lives of people with disability. So on behalf of the Hopkins Centre, thank you very much for engaging with our online event, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you.